Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 35 years old. This happened in the remote Sandhills region of Nebraska, along the Niobrara River, about 40 miles southwest of Valentine. I'd come there to disappear from a world that had become too much to bear. After my divorce finalized and the company I'd worked at for 12 years laid me off, I made a decision that seemed logical at the time. I would live off-grid, away from the suffocating maze of modern life. I'd saved enough money to last 2 years if I was careful, and I had enough wilderness experience from my college days to survive. The plan was simple: find a remote spot along the Niobrara River, set up a semi-permanent camp, and live off the land until I figured out what came next. I'd researched the area extensively. The Niobrara River cuts through some of the most isolated country in Nebraska, winding through the sandhills where you can walk for days without seeing another human being. The nearest town, Johnstown, was a ghost of a place with maybe 30 residents, and even that was 15 miles east of where I planned to settle. The spot I chose was perfect, a small clearing beside the river, sheltered by a grove of ancient cottonwoods. The nearest road was a dirt track 3 miles south, barely visible on any map. I'd hiked in with everything I needed: a military surplus tent, sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, a camp stove, water purification tablets, fishing gear, and enough canned goods to last a month while I learned to forage and hunt. For the first 2 weeks, everything went according to plan. The isolation was exactly what I needed. I woke with the sun, spent my days exploring the area, learning which plants were edible, where the fish congregated in the river's bends. The silence was profound. Not the dead quiet of a house, but the living silence of wilderness, full of wind through grass and the distant calls of meadowlarks. I should have known something was wrong when my electronics started acting up. It began with my phone. I'd brought it mainly for emergencies, though there was no signal out there anyway. The battery would drain completely overnight, even when the phone was powered off. Then my GPS unit started giving impossible readings, coordinates that would have placed me in the middle of the North Platte River, 100 miles away. I figured it was just the remote location interfering with satellite signals. The real strangeness started during my 3rd week. I was returning to camp one evening after checking my fishing lines when I heard someone calling for help. The voice was distant, echoing across the water from somewhere upstream. It was a man's voice, hoarse and desperate, shouting the same words over and over: "Help me, please, anyone." I dropped my gear and ran toward the sound, following the riverbank as the calls continued. The voice seemed to move, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind, sometimes across the water. I called back asking where the person was, but got no response except for those same desperate pleas. I searched until full darkness fell, using my flashlight to scan both sides of the river. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone in distress. When I finally returned to camp, exhausted and confused, the calling had stopped. That night I lay in my tent listening to the sounds of the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes were yipping. Closer, I could hear the soft splash of something large moving through the water, probably a deer coming down to drink. But underneath it all, so faint I wasn't sure I was really hearing it, were those same cries for help. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, or maybe the echoes of my own voice from earlier, somehow caught and repeated by the landscape. But sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I found footprints. They were in the soft mud near my camp's water source, about 50 yards from my tent. Human footprints, but wrong somehow. They were the right size, larger than mine, maybe a size 12 or 13, but they seemed too deep, as if whoever made them weighed far more than their size suggested. And there was something odd about the tread pattern. It looked like work boots, but the impressions were uneven, as if the person had been limping badly or had something wrong with their feet. The prints led from the water's edge toward my camp, stopping just at the tree line. There, they simply ended. No return path, no indication of where the person had gone. I spent that day in a state of nervous energy, constantly scanning the horizon, listening for any sound that didn't belong. When evening came, I built up my fire larger than usual and kept my knife close at hand. The calls started again just after sunset. This time they were closer, definitely coming from across the river. I could make out words more clearly. "Help me. I'm lost. Please, I can see your fire." I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it across the water. "Where are you?" I shouted back. "Here, can't you see me? I'm right here." I swept the beam back and forth across the opposite bank but saw nothing except tall grass and scattered trees. "Keep talking. I'll try to get to you." "I can't move. Something's wrong with my leg." The voice was definitely male, middle-aged with a slight accent I couldn't place. There was genuine pain in it, real desperation. Whatever else was happening, someone was in trouble. I had an inflatable kayak I'd brought for fishing. It took me 20 minutes to get it set up and launch it. The current was stronger than I'd expected, and it took all my strength to paddle across. The whole time, the voice kept calling, guiding me. "That's right. You're almost here. I can see your light." I reached the far bank and pulled the kayak up onto a small beach. "Where are you?" I called, playing my flashlight beam across the area. "Here. Right here." The voice seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere. I walked inland, following the sound, pushing through tall grass that came up to my waist. The beam of my flashlight created a small circle of visibility in an ocean of darkness. "I don't see you," I called. "Keep talking. I'm hurt. Please hurry." I was getting frightened now. The voice was so close it seemed like the person should be within arm's reach, but there was nothing there. Just empty prairie stretching away into blackness. "Where exactly are you?" I tried to keep the growing panic out of my voice. "Right behind you." Ice water flooded my veins. I spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. Nothing, just the tall grass waving in the wind. "That wasn't funny," I said to the darkness. "If you need help, I'm here to help, but I need to be able to find you." Silence. I waited for 10 minutes, calling out periodically but got no response. Finally, I made my way back to the kayak and paddled across the river. The current had carried me downstream, and it took another 20 minutes to hike back to my camp. The fire had burned down to coals, but it was still giving off enough light to see by. As I approached, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were new footprints around my camp, the same oversized, oddly deep impressions I'd found that morning. They circled my tent, my cooking area, my supply cache. Whoever had made them had been examining everything while I was gone. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the prints led directly into my tent. I stood outside for a long time, listening. No sounds from inside, no movement, but the tent fabric seemed to be moving slightly, as if someone were breathing on it from within. "Hello," I called softly. No response. I unzipped the outer flap slowly, my knife in my other hand. The flashlight beam revealed my sleeping bag, exactly as I'd left it. No one inside. But the air in the tent felt wrong, warm and humid, like someone had been breathing heavily in the enclosed space. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, feeding it wood and watching the darkness around me. Every sound made me jump. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of something moving through the grass, the splash of a beaver slapping its tail on the water. Around 3 a.m, the calls started again. This time, they were coming from right outside my camp. "Help me," the voice said, quiet now, almost conversational. "I'm so tired." I grabbed a burning stick from the fire and held it up like a torch. "Who's there?" "It's me, David. I've been lost for so long." The voice was coming from the edge of the firelight, just barely visible in the dancing shadows. I could make out a shape, tall, thin, definitely human. "David?" I kept the burning branch between us. "Are you the one who was calling earlier?" "Yes, I fell, hurt my leg, been wandering for days." He stepped forward into the light, and I got my first good look at him. He was tall, maybe 6'4", with long dark hair and a scraggly beard. His clothes were torn and dirty: jeans, a flannel shirt, work boots. He was limping heavily, favoring his right leg, but it was his face that disturbed me. It was gaunt, almost skeletal, with deep-set eyes that reflected the firelight like an animal's. "Jesus, you look terrible," I said. "Here, sit down. Let me see that leg." "Thank you," he said, settling down across the fire from me. "I thought I was going to die out here." I heated some water and made coffee, giving him a cup and a can of beef stew. He ate ravenously, barely pausing to chew. While he ate, I examined his leg. There was a nasty gash on his shin, infected and swollen. "This needs medical attention," I said. "I've got some antibiotics, but you really should get to a hospital." "No hospitals," he said quickly. "I'll be fine, just need to rest." Something in his tone made me look at him more closely. In the firelight, his features seemed to shift and change. One moment he looked like a normal man, tired and hurt. The next, his face seemed wrong somehow, the proportions off, the angles too sharp. "Where did you come from?" I asked. "The nearest town is 15 miles away." "Johnstown," he said. "Been camping up north. Got turned around in the dark." That was possible. The sandhills could be disorienting, especially at night. Still, something felt off about his story. "I'll share my camp tonight," I said. "In the morning, I can help you get back to town." "That's very kind," he said. "I'll just rest here by the fire, if that's all right." I gave him a blanket and settled into my tent, but I didn't sleep. Through the thin nylon, I could hear him moving around outside. Not restless movement, purposeful, careful movement, as if he were examining my belongings. Around dawn, I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. It was David's voice, but he was talking to someone else, having a quiet conversation with another person I hadn't seen. "Been alone for 3 weeks," he was saying. "Plenty of food, good spot." A different voice answered, too low for me to make out the words. "No," David said. "Not yet. Soon." I lay perfectly still, barely breathing. Who was he talking to? I hadn't heard anyone else approach the camp. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, David was alone, sitting by the dead fire. He turned as I emerged from the tent and smiled. It was a horrible smile, too wide, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp. "Good morning," he said. "Sleep well?" "Fine," I lied. "How's the leg?" "Much better. I think I'll stay another day if you don't mind, just to make sure it's healed properly." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from this man. But what could I do? He claimed to be injured, and I couldn't just abandon someone in the wilderness. Besides, in daylight he seemed normal enough. Friendly even. Maybe I'd imagine the conversation. We spent the day together, and I began to relax. David was knowledgeable about the area, pointing out edible plants I hadn't noticed and showing me better spots along the river for fishing. He told me he'd grown up in Nebraska, spent years wandering the backcountry. His stories were detailed and convincing. But there were little things that bothered me. He never seemed to blink. His laugh was just a fraction too long, too loud, and when he thought I wasn't looking, his face would go completely blank, as if no one were home behind his eyes. That evening, while I was preparing dinner, David offered to gather firewood. He disappeared into the trees, and I was glad for the solitude. I needed time to think, to process what I was feeling. He was gone for over an hour. When he returned, his arms full of wood, something was different about him. It took me a moment to figure out what it was. He wasn't limping anymore. "Leg feeling better?" I asked. He looked down at his leg as if he'd forgotten about the injury. "Oh, yes, much better." But when I looked at his shin where the gash had been, I could see no sign of the wound. not even a scar. That night, I pretended to go to sleep early. I lay in my tent with my knife in my hand, listening. For a while, everything was quiet. Then I heard David moving around the camp again, the same careful, examining movement. And then I heard him talking again. Not to another person this time, to himself. 3 weeks, he was saying in that same conversational tone. Good spot, isolated. No one will come looking. My blood turned to ice. Knife in the tent, he continued. Small caliber rifle. Easy. He was planning to kill me. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, trying to think of what to do. I could try to sneak out of the tent and run, but where would I go? It was 15 miles to the nearest house, through terrain I barely knew. And David, if that was really his name, seemed to know the area much better than I did. Soon, he said to himself. Very soon. I heard him moving toward my tent. The footsteps were different now. Not the careful, quiet steps of before, but heavy, deliberate, predatory. The zipper on my tent began to move. I gripped the knife tighter, my heart hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. The tent flap opened slowly, and David's silhouette appeared in the opening. But it wasn't David anymore. The shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin, joints bending in ways human joints shouldn't bend. In the moonlight, I could see his face, and it was no longer human at all. The features had stretched and distorted, the mouth opening to reveal rows of teeth like broken glass. I screamed and lunged forward with the knife. The blade caught him in the shoulder and he shrieked. Not a human sound, but something like the cry of a wounded eagle mixed with the howl of a coyote. He stumbled backward and I scrambled out of the tent. In the moonlight, I could see him clearly now. Whatever he was, he had never been human. His limbs were too long, his fingers ending in black claws. His skin had a grayish, mottled appearance, like tree bark. Wendigo, I whispered, remembering the old stories my grandfather had told me about the cannibal spirits that haunted the northern wilderness. The thing that had called itself David looked at me with eyes like black holes. When it spoke, its voice was no longer human either, a sound like wind through dead leaves. You cannot run, it said. I know these lands. I have walked them for centuries. I turned and ran anyway. Behind me, I heard it following, not running, but moving with a horrible loping gait that covered ground faster than any human could sprint. I crashed through the tall grass, stumbling over hidden rocks and prairie dog holes, guided only by moonlight. The kayak. If I could reach the kayak, maybe I could get across the river. I could hear it gaining on me, its breathing like the whisper of wind through a graveyard. Something slashed across my back. Claws, just barely missing my spine. I stumbled, but kept running. The riverbank appeared ahead of me. I half fell, half slid down to the water's edge where I'd left the kayak. It was still there, pulled up on the small beach. I dragged it into the water and jumped in, grabbing the paddle. The current caught me immediately, carrying me downstream faster than I'd expected. Behind me, I could hear the Wendigo shrieking its rage. I paddled frantically for the far shore, fighting the current that wanted to carry me away from my camp. When I finally reached the other side, I was a quarter-mile downstream from where I'd started. I pulled the kayak up onto the bank and looked back across the water. The Wendigo was standing on the opposite shore, watching me. Even from that distance, I could see its eyes glowing in the darkness. It began to walk along the bank, paralleling my position, testing the water with one foot, then withdrawing. It couldn't cross running water. That had to be it. The old legend said that certain spirits couldn't cross flowing water. I watched it pace back and forth, growing more agitated. Then it did something that made my skin crawl. It began to call out in David's voice again. "Kenneth, help me. It's David. I'm hurt." The voice was perfect, exactly as it had been when I first heard it. But now I knew what was really happening. How long had it been watching me? How long had it been learning my voice, my mannerisms, preparing to replace me just as it had replaced the real David? If there had ever been a real David at all, I backed away from the water's edge, never taking my eyes off the creature. It followed my movement, staying directly across from me. "Kenneth," it called, "don't leave me. I need help." I turned and ran toward my camp. If I could gather some supplies, I might be able to make it to the road, maybe even to Johnstown. But when I reached the clearing, I stopped in horror. My camp was destroyed. The tent was shredded, my supplies scattered and broken. The smell of spoiled meat filled the air. All my food had been torn open and left to rot. Even my water bottles had been smashed. And there, written in the mud near my ruined tent, was a message in a language I didn't recognize. The letters seemed to shift and crawl in the moonlight, making my eyes water when I tried to read them. I grabbed what I could: my knife, a water bottle that wasn't completely destroyed, a handful of energy bars that hadn't been torn open. Everything else was ruined. The nearest road was 3 miles south. From there, it was another 12 miles to Johnstown. I'd have to travel through the night on foot, through country I barely knew. I started walking. Behind me, across the river, I could hear the Wendigo calling. Sometimes it used David's voice. Sometimes it used my own voice, calling for help just as I had when I first heard it. And sometimes, most terrifyingly, it used voices I didn't recognize. Men, women, children, all calling for help, all begging to be saved. How many people had it encountered over the years? How many had it studied, learned, replaced? I walked through the night, following a game trail that led roughly south. Every shadow looked like a predator. Every sound made me jump. The moon was high and bright, which helped with navigation but also made me feel exposed, vulnerable. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was my own voice, calling from somewhere behind me. "Help! Someone help me! I'm lost!" The Wendigo had crossed the river somehow. It was following me, using my own voice to try to lure other potential victims. I ran then, abandoning any attempt at stealth. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I crashed through a grove of cottonwoods. The game trail disappeared, and I found myself stumbling through tall grass and scattered rocks. My own voice followed me, always seeming to come from just behind the last hill I'd crossed. "Please, anyone, I'm hurt." Dawn was breaking when I finally saw it, a dirt road cutting through the prairie like a scar. I'd made it. But I was still 12 miles from town, and the thing behind me wasn't giving up. I followed the road east toward Johnstown. My feet were bleeding in my boots, and I was desperately thirsty. The energy bars were long gone. The sun climbed higher, and the calling behind me stopped. Maybe the Wendigo couldn't function in daylight. Maybe it had given up. Or maybe it was just being more careful, staying out of sight. I walked for hours. The road was empty. No cars, no signs of life, just endless prairie stretching away in all directions. By noon, I was beginning to hallucinate from dehydration and exhaustion. I kept seeing people in the distance, waving at me, but when I looked directly at them, they disappeared. It was mid-afternoon when I finally saw the buildings of Johnstown rising from the prairie like a mirage. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The town was empty. Not just quiet, completely abandoned. Windows were boarded up, cars sat rusted in driveways, weeds grew through cracks in the sidewalks. It looked like it had been empty for years. I walked down Main Street calling out, but my voice just echoed off empty storefronts. The post office, the general store, the tiny diner, all empty, all covered in dust and cobwebs. In front of what had been the town hall, I found a historical marker. It was weather-beaten and hard to read, but I could make out enough: Johnstown, founded 1887, abandoned 1923, population at abandonment, 0. The marker went on to explain that Johnstown had been a railroad town that died when the tracks were rerouted. The last residents had left in 1923, and the town had been a ghost ever since. But that was impossible. I'd researched the area carefully. Modern maps showed Johnstown as an active community. I'd even found references to it online, descriptions of the current residents. Unless I thought about my GPS unit giving impossible readings, my phone battery draining overnight, the maps that suddenly didn't make sense. What if the Wendigo could do more than just mimic voices? What if it could manipulate technology, create false information, lure people into the wilderness with lies about towns that no longer existed? I sank down on the steps of the abandoned town hall, overwhelmed by the realization of how completely I'd been manipulated. There was no town, no help, no one who even knew where I was, and somewhere out there the thing that wore faces like masks was still hunting. As the sun began to set, I heard it again, my own voice calling from the edge of town. "Hello? Is anyone there? I need help." It had followed me all this way, and now, in this dead town where no one would ever think to look, it would finish what it had started. I looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, somewhere to make a stand. The old general store still had some of its windows intact. Maybe I could barricade myself inside, wait for daylight. I ran to the store and tried the door. Locked. I picked up a rock and smashed one of the windows, cutting my arm as I climbed through. Inside, the store was a time capsule. Shelves still held goods from the 1920s, canned foods with labels I didn't recognize, bottles of patent medicines, boxes of ammunition for guns that weren't made anymore. I grabbed a box of rifle shells and looked around for a weapon. In the back room, I found an old Winchester lever action rifle. It was rusty but functional. I loaded it with shaking hands as the voice outside grew closer. "I'm hurt. Please, someone help me." I could see it through the broken window, a shape moving down Main Street calling in my voice. But it wasn't bothering to maintain the human disguise anymore. It moved like a spider, all joints and angles, its two long limbs carrying it forward in a horrible scuttling gait. It stopped in front of the store and tilted its head, listening. Then it smiled with my face and spoke with my voice. "I know you're in there, Kenneth. I can smell your fear." I raised the rifle, sighting down the barrel at the thing wearing my appearance. "You can't run forever," it said. "This is my domain. These are my hunting grounds. And you are my prey." It began to change as I watched, cycling through different faces like a deck of cards being shuffled. David, myself, a woman with kind eyes, a child with pigtails, a bearded man in a flannel shirt. "So many faces," it said, now speaking in a chorus of voices. "So many meals. You'll just be one more." I pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet caught the Wendigo in the chest, spinning it around. Black blood sprayed across the street. It looked down at the wound, then back at me, and laughed. "Iron," it said in a voice like grinding stone. How quaint. It began walking toward the store, the wound already closing. I fired again and again. Each shot hit. Each shot drew more of that black blood, but none of them stopped it. It reached the broken window and began to climb through. In desperation, I grabbed one of the old bottles from the shelf, something labeled Holy Water, blessed by Father Murphy, 1922. I had no idea if it would work, but I'd heard stories. I smashed the bottle against the Wendigo's face as it came through the window. The scream that followed was unlike anything I'd ever heard. The Wendigo thrashed backward, clawing at its face where the holy water had splashed. Smoke rose from its skin, and I could smell burning flesh. "Impossible," it hissed. "That should have lost its power decades ago." But it was backing away, and for the first time, I saw fear in its stolen eyes. I grabbed another bottle of holy water and advanced. The Wendigo retreated, stumbling over its own feet in its haste to get away from me. "Some things don't lose their power," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "Some things endure." I threw the second bottle, catching it on the shoulder. More screaming, more smoke. The Wendigo turned and fled, running down Main Street on all fours like a wounded animal. I followed it outside, holding a third bottle like a weapon. The Wendigo had stopped at the edge of town, just visible in the gathering darkness. "This isn't over," it called back in my voice. "I'll be waiting. I'll always be waiting, and then it was gone, melting into the shadows like it had never been there at all. I spent that night in the store, barricaded behind overturned shelves, the remaining bottles of holy water within easy reach. But the Wendigo didn't return. When morning came, I set out walking again. This time, I followed the old railroad tracks instead of the road. Tracks had to lead somewhere, even if they were abandoned. It took me 2 days to reach civilization, a real town with real people and working phones. The sheriff who took my report was skeptical, but he didn't ask too many questions when I said I'd gotten lost in the sandhills and my camping gear had been destroyed by bears. I never went back for my truck, let it rust where I'd parked it. But sometimes, late at night, I get phone calls from my old number, the phone I left behind in that ruined camp. When I answer, I hear my own voice on the other end, asking for help, claiming to be lost. I always hang up immediately. But I know it's still out there, in the vast emptiness of the sandhills, waiting, watching, learning new voices, new faces, new ways to lure the unwary into its domain. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if I really escaped at all, or if what I think is my life is just another one of its elaborate deceptions, another web of lies designed to lead someone else into the wilderness. After all, how would I really know the difference? The thing about Wendigos, the old stories say, is that they're always hungry, and they're very, very patient. I've been thinking about taking another camping trip lately, somewhere remote, somewhere quiet, somewhere I can finally rest. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Samuel R. McKelvey National Forest, deep in the Nebraska sandhills, 3 miles southeast of Valentine. I still wake up screaming some nights, clawing at my sheets like I'm trying to dig my way out of that God-forsaken wilderness. It was supposed to be a simple team-building exercise. Our supervisor at Midwest Insurance Solutions, Dave Kowalski, thought it would be great for morale if the 4 of us from the claims department spent a long weekend camping together. Fresh air, no cell towers, just good old-fashioned bonding, he'd said with that corporate smile that never reached his eyes. Sarah Rodriguez, our senior adjuster, was the only one with real outdoor experience. David Jones, our newest hire, seemed excited about getting off the grid for once. Jennifer Williams, no relation despite the shared last name, just wanted to get away from her messy divorce proceedings. I should have said no. Should have made up some excuse about my grandmother being sick or needing to work overtime. But I'd been having the dreams again. The ones where I'm 8 years old, lost in the woods behind my childhood home in Lincoln, crying for my mother while something with too many teeth watches me from between the trees. My therapist said confronting my fears might help. Dr. Martinez had no idea what she was unleashing. We left Omaha on a Friday afternoon in early October when the leaves were just starting to turn and the air carried that crisp bite of approaching winter. David drove his beat-up Jeep Cherokee, loaded down with camping gear that looked like it had been purchased that morning from Dick's Sporting Goods. The drive to Valentine took us through increasingly desolate country, endless rolling hills covered in prairie grass that whispered secrets to the wind. "Jesus, it's like driving through purgatory," Jennifer muttered from the passenger seat, chain-smoking Marlboro Lights despite Sarah's complaints about the smell. Her bleached blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger than her 34 years, but her eyes held the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting too many battles for too long. Sarah sat behind David, methodically checking and rechecking our supply list. At 26, she was the youngest of us, but her confidence in the outdoors made her feel like our natural leader. She'd grown up on a ranch outside Broken Bow and could read weather patterns like scripture. Her dark hair was braided tight against her skull, and she wore practical hiking boots that had clearly seen many miles of trail. "The remoteness is the point," she said, not looking up from her clipboard. "No distractions, no escape routes. Forces you to actually deal with your problems instead of running away." I caught David's eyes in the rearview mirror and saw him wince. At 24, he was still figuring out how to navigate office dynamics, and Sarah's comment hit a little too close to home. He'd been having trouble adjusting to the corporate world after dropping out of UNL's engineering program. His hands were always moving, tapping on his steering wheel, drumming on his desk, fidgeting with pens. Nervous energy that never seemed to find an outlet. "Speaking of escape routes," I said, trying to lighten the mood, "exactly where are we going? The directions you gave us just say, 'Follow Highway 83 until you see the sign.'" Sarah finally looked up, and I noticed something flicker across her face. Uncertainty, maybe, or second thoughts. My uncle used to take me hunting out here when I was a kid. There's an old campsite about 3 miles into the forest right along Bone Creek. No marked trails, no other campers, complete isolation. Bone Creek? Jennifer laughed, but it sounded forced. That's not ominous at all. Named after all the buffalo bones they found there in the 1880s, Sarah explained. The whole area was a massive killing ground during the hide hunting days. They say you can still find pieces if you know where to look. The conversation died after that, each of us lost in our own thoughts as the afternoon light began to fade. The landscape outside grew increasingly alien, rolling hills of sand and grass that seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the occasional windmill or abandoned farmstead. The sky was too big here, too empty, pressing down on us like a physical weight. We turned off Highway 83 just as the sun touched the horizon, following a dirt road that quickly deteriorated into little more than tire ruts in the sand. David's Jeep bounced and lurched through the deepening twilight, headlights cutting weak swaths through the gathering darkness. My chest began to tighten with each mile we traveled away from civilization. "You sure you know where we're going?" David asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as we navigated around a washout that looked fresh. "Pretty sure," Sarah replied, but her voice carried a note of doubt that made my stomach clench. "It's been a few years since I've been out here. Things change." 20 minutes later, we found the creek. The sound of water moving over rocks was oddly comforting after the oppressive silence of the drive, and for a moment I felt my anxiety ease. David parked the Jeep in a small clearing surrounded by stunted oak trees and patches of tall grass that rustled in the evening breeze. "This is it?" Jennifer asked, peering out at the darkness beyond our headlights. "It looks like the set of a horror movie." She wasn't wrong. In the pale illumination, I could make out the skeletal remains of an old fire ring and what might have been a picnic table, half buried in sand and debris. Beyond that, the creek gurgled invisibly through a stand of trees that seemed to lean inward, as if listening to our conversation. "It'll look better in the morning," Sarah said with forced optimism. "Besides, we're here to rough it, remember? No amenities, no comfort zone." We spent the next hour setting up camp by flashlight, stumbling around in the darkness and cursing as we tried to figure out tent poles and guy lines. The temperature was dropping fast and our breath began to fog in the beam of our lights. I kept thinking I saw movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that didn't belong to any of us, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. David got our campfire started around 8 o'clock, using what seemed like half our firewood to coax a decent blaze from the damp kindling. We huddled around the flames, sharing a bottle of bourbon that Jennifer had smuggled in her backpack and trying to pretend we were having fun. "So," David said, taking a long pull from the bottle before passing it to Sarah. "Truth or dare? 20 questions? What do people do on these things?" "We could tell ghost stories," Jennifer suggested with a bitter laugh. "Really complete the whole doomed camping trip vibe." "Actually," Sarah said slowly, "my uncle used to tell me stories about this area. Said the Lakota considered it cursed ground, wouldn't hunt here even when buffalo were scarce." "Cursed how?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Sarah stared into the fire, her face flickering in the orange light. "They called it the place where hunger lives. Said there was something here that could never be satisfied, something that had been feeding for longer than human memory." A log popped in the fire, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness, and we all jumped. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, and for a long moment afterward, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the grass. "Great," David muttered. "Just what I needed to hear before trying to sleep in a thin piece of nylon." But as unsettling as Sarah's story was, exhaustion won out over anxiety, and by 10 o'clock we'd all retreated to our tents. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the creak and the restless movement of my tent mates settling in for the night. Jennifer was in the tent next to ours, and I could hear her tossing and turning, probably thinking about the divorce papers waiting for her back home. I must have dozed off because I was jolted awake by the sound of my phone buzzing. The display showed 2:17 a.m., but there were no bars, no signal, just a text message that couldn't have come through. "Help us." My blood went cold. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening to the darkness. David was snoring softly beside me, and from Jennifer's tent came the sound of deep, regular breathing. Sarah's tent was silent. Too silent. I unzipped my tent flap as quietly as possible and peered out at the campsite. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting everything in a hellish red light. Sarah's tent was maybe 10 feet away, but it looked wrong, somehow. Deflated. Empty. "Sarah?" I whispered. No response. I crawled out of my tent, my bare feet immediately going numb in the cold sand. The wind had picked up, making the trees around our campsite creak and groan like old bones. I could smell something on the air, something rank and organic, like meat left too long in the sun. Sarah's tent was unzipped from the inside, the flaps hanging open like a mouth. Her sleeping bag was empty, but warm. Whatever had happened recently. "Sarah," I called out louder this time. David stirred in our tent. "What's going on?" "Sarah's gone," I said, my voice cracking. "Her tent's empty." That got everyone moving. David and Jennifer emerged from their tents, all of us standing around the dying fire in our long underwear and socks, looking like refugees from some disaster. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees, and our breath came out in thick clouds that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have. "Maybe she went to use the bathroom," Jennifer suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. "In bare feet?" David pointed to Sarah's hiking boots, still sitting neatly beside her tent. "In this cold?" I grabbed my flashlight and started searching the perimeter of our campsite, calling Sarah's name into the darkness. The beam seemed pathetically weak against the vast emptiness surrounding us, like trying to hold back the ocean with a teaspoon. Every shadow could have hidden something watching us, waiting. "There," David said suddenly. "I see tracks." He was right. In the sand near the creek, barely visible in our combined flashlight beams, were footprints. Sarah's bare feet, heading downstream toward a thicket of willows and cottonwoods. But there was something wrong with the tracks. They were too deep, as if she'd been carrying something heavy, or being carried. "Should we follow them?" Jennifer asked. "We should call for help," I said, pulling out my phone. No signal, not even emergency calls. David tried his phone, then Jennifer. Nothing. The devices that had been our lifeline to the outside world were now just expensive paperweights. "The Jeep," I said. "We can drive back to the highway, flag down a trucker." But when we reached the clearing where David had parked, the Jeep was gone. Not stolen. Gone. As if it had never been there at all. The tire tracks we'd followed in were gone too, erased by wind that hadn't been strong enough to move the sand when we'd arrived. "This isn't possible," David whispered. "Cars don't just disappear." "Neither do people," Jennifer shot back, her voice rising toward hysteria. "But Sarah's gone, and now we're stuck out here with no way to get help." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the same sensation I'd experienced as a child when I'd realized I was lost, that the woods around me had become something alien and hostile. My hands started to shake, and not just from the cold. "We need to find Sarah," I said, more to convince myself than the others. "She could be hurt, Lost? We can't just abandon her. So we followed the tracks downstream, staying close together and sweeping our flashlights back and forth across the creek bank. The sound of water over rocks that had seemed comforting earlier now sounded like whispered warnings, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made us freeze, listening for threats that might be closing in. The tracks led us deeper into the forest, away from our campsite and any hope of finding our way back before dawn. The trees grew thicker here, their branches interwoven overhead like a canopy that blocked out the stars. Our flashlight beams seemed to be absorbed by the darkness, and I had the unsettling feeling that we were walking into the throat of some vast creature. "How far are we going to follow these?" Jennifer panted. She was already exhausted, her city-soft feet suffering in her thin tennis shoes. "We could be walking in circles." "Just a little further," I said, though I had no idea if that was true. The tracks were becoming harder to follow as the ground grew rockier, and I was starting to suspect that we were being led rather than following. That's when we heard Sarah's voice. "Help me!" she called from somewhere ahead, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space between the trees. "Please, I'm hurt." We rushed toward the sound, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over fallen logs in our haste to reach her. But when we broke through into a small clearing, we found only emptiness. The voice seemed to be coming from all around us now, bouncing off the trees like a distorted recording. "Help me. Please, I'm hurt." Always the same words, in the same tone. No variation, no emotion, like a loop playing over and over. "Sarah," David called out. "Where are you?" The voice stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was so complete it felt like a physical presence. No wind, no creek, no night sounds. Just the rasp of our breathing and the hammer of our hearts. That's when I noticed the smell again. That rank, organic stench that seemed to cling to the inside of my nostrils. And underneath it, something else. Something familiar. Perfume. Sarah's perfume. "We need to get back to camp," I said quietly. "Now." "But Sarah," Jennifer started. "That wasn't Sarah," I cut her off. "I don't know what it was, but it wasn't her." We backtracked as quickly as we could, following our own footprints in the muddy ground beside the creek. But the way back seemed longer than the way out, and after what felt like hours of walking, we still hadn't reached our campsite. The creek had changed too. What had been a gentle stream was now a rushing torrent that sounded like voices screaming in a language I didn't recognize. "We're lost," Jennifer said, and I could hear the edge of panic in her voice. "We're fucking lost." "No, we're not," David said, but he didn't sound convinced. "We just follow the creek back. It has to lead to camp." But it didn't. The creek led us to a clearing I'd never seen before, where the remains of an old campfire sat cold and dark in a ring of stones. Scattered around it were pieces of camping gear, a torn sleeping bag, a broken lantern, a backpack with its contents spilled across the ground. "Jesus," David breathed. "What happened here?" I knelt down and picked up one of the scattered items, a driver's license in a plastic wallet. The photo showed a young man with dark hair and a nervous smile. The name read Marcus Chen, and the address was in Denver. The license had expired 3 years ago. "There are more," Jennifer said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was right. Scattered throughout the clearing were personal items from what looked like dozens of different camping trips. Licenses and credit cards and photos, all of them years old. All of them from people who had come to this place and never left. "We need to get out of here," I said, standing up and backing away from the makeshift graveyard. "Right now." That's when we heard the laughter. It started low and bubbling, like water over rocks, but gradually rose in pitch until it became a shriek that seemed to come from the sky itself. The sound went on, echoing off the trees and surrounding us from all directions. It was the most inhuman sound I'd ever heard, and it froze my blood in my veins. "Run!" I gasped, and we did. We crashed through the forest like animals, branches tearing at our clothes and rocks cutting our feet. Behind us, the laughter followed, sometimes seeming close enough to touch the backs of our necks, sometimes fading into the distance only to surge back stronger than before. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually we burst out of the trees and found ourselves back at our campsite. The fire had somehow rekindled itself, flames dancing higher than we'd ever built them, casting wild shadows across the clearing, and sitting beside the fire, warming her hands, was Sarah. "There you are," she said, turning to smile at us. "I was wondering where you'd gone." We stumbled to a halt, gasping and bleeding, staring at her in shock. She looked perfectly normal. Clean clothes, neat hair, no sign that she'd been missing for hours in the wilderness. "Sarah," Jennifer panted, "where the hell have you been? We've been looking for you all night." "Looking for me?" Sarah's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I've been right here. You're the ones who wandered off." There was something wrong with her voice. The words were right, but the inflection was off, like someone reading from a script in a language they didn't understand. And her eyes. Her eyes were completely black, reflecting the firelight like dark mirrors. "What time is it?" David asked, checking his phone. The display showed 2:17 a.m., the same time I'd woken up to the text message, the same time it had been when we'd first discovered Sarah missing. "You look tired," Sarah said, and now there was something predatory in her smile. "Why don't you sit down? Rest. The fire's so warm." I felt a strange compulsion to do exactly that, to walk over and settle down beside the flames and let the heat soak into my bones. My feet began moving of their own accord, and I had to force myself to stop. "No," I said, my voice coming out as a croak. "Something's wrong here. This isn't real." Sarah's head tilted to one side, too far, at an angle that would have snapped a normal person's neck. "What's not real, Michael? The fire? The woods? Me?" "You're not Sarah," I said, backing away. "Sarah doesn't smile like that." The thing wearing Sarah's face stood up, and as it did, its limbs seemed to stretch and elongate, becoming spider-thin and wrong. Its skin took on a grayish pallor, and its fingernails grew into yellowed claws. "No," it agreed, its voice dropping into a register no human throat could produce. "I'm not Sarah. I'm so much more than Sarah ever was. I'm hunger. I'm the emptiness that gnaws at the center of everything. And I've been waiting so long for you to come back to me, Michael." "Come back?" I stammered. "Oh yes," the thing hissed. "Don't you remember? You were here before, when you were small, lost and crying for your mother. I let you go then. You were barely a mouthful and I was feeling generous. But I marked you. I've been calling you back ever since, in your dreams, in your fears, and now you're here. And you've brought me such lovely friends." Behind me, I heard Jennifer whimper. When I risked a glance back, I saw that David was staring at the creature with a strange, dazed expression, as if he were under some kind of spell. "David," I said sharply, "David, don't listen to it." But it was too late. David walked past me toward the fire, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. The Sarah thing reached out with one elongated arm and touched his forehead with a single claw. David's scream was cut short as his body began to change. His skin turned the same sickly gray as the creature's, and his eyes went black. When he turned to look at us, his face was David's face, but wrong in every detail. The smile too wide, the expression too hungry. "Run," I whispered to Jennifer, and we did. We fled into the forest again, but this time we could hear pursuit behind us. Not just the laughter, but the sound of feet pounding through the underbrush. Or maybe not feet. Maybe something else entirely. "The creek," Jennifer gasped as we ran. "If we follow it downstream, it has to lead somewhere. Has to lead out." We crashed through the trees toward the sound of water, but when we reached the creek bank, we found that the stream had changed again. Now it ran red in the moonlight, thick and viscous like blood. The smell rising from it was overwhelming, metallic and sweet and wrong. Jesus Christ, Jennifer moaned, falling to her knees. What is this place? Before I could answer, David stepped out of the trees on the opposite bank. He moved with that same unnatural, jerky gait, and his smile was so wide it seemed to split his face in half. "Come back to the fire," he called across the bloody water. "Sarah's waiting. She wants to play." "That's not David," I said, pulling Jennifer to her feet. "Come on, we have to keep moving." But everywhere we went, they were waiting for us. David at the creek crossing, Sarah in the clearing with the scattered belongings, sometimes both of them together, holding hands and singing nursery rhymes in voices like broken glass. We ran until our legs gave out, until our lungs burned and our feet were shredded and bleeding. But no matter how far we traveled, we always ended up back at that clearing, back at that fire, with those things wearing our friends' faces waiting for us. "This is hell," Jennifer sobbed, curled up against a tree trunk. "We're dead, and this is hell." "No," I said, though I was beginning to wonder if she might be right. "No, there has to be a way out. There's always a way out." But as the hours passed, or seemed to pass, time had become fluid and unreliable in this place, I began to understand that the creature hadn't been lying when it said it had marked me. This was my prison, my punishment for escaping when I was 8 years old. And now I'd brought 2 innocent people into it with me. The sky began to lighten toward what might have been dawn, though the light was wrong, too red, too angry. And with the light came a new horror, the sound of Jennifer screaming. I spun around to find David, or the thing that looked like David, standing behind her with his arms wrapped around her throat. His fingers had grown into claws, and blood was seeping through Jennifer's shirt where they dug into her flesh. "Let her go," I shouted, but the David thing only smiled wider. "Why would I do that?" it asked in David's voice. "She's so warm, so full of life, so scared." Jennifer's eyes met mine, and I saw the terror there, but also something else: determination. She mouthed a single word: "Run." Then she drove her elbow back into David's ribs with all her strength. The creature howled and loosened its grip just enough for Jennifer to break free. She stumbled toward me, blood streaming down her front, but she'd only made it a few steps when David's claws raked across her back. Jennifer fell face first into the sand, twitched once, and was still. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This thing had taken my friends, had tormented us for hours, had trapped us in this nightmare landscape, and now it had murdered Jennifer right in front of me. I charged at the David thing with a scream of pure fury, tackling it around the waist and driving it backward into a tree. We went down in a tangle of limbs, and I felt its claws rake across my chest, but I didn't care. I grabbed a fallen branch, thick as a baseball bat and sharp at one end, and drove it into the creature's chest. Black blood erupted from the wound, steaming in the cold air. The thing that looked like David writhed and shrieked, but the sound was already changing, becoming something else. As I watched, its features began to shift and flow like melting wax, revealing something underneath that my mind refused to process. I twisted the branch deeper, and the creature's death scream shattered the false dawn. The red light flickered and went out, plunging us back into natural darkness. But it was a different darkness now, clean and normal, without the oppressive weight of malevolence. I staggered to my feet, gasping, and looked around. I was standing in a small clearing beside a creek, but it was the right creek now. Clear water running over stones, not the blood-red torrent from the nightmare. And there, maybe 50 yards away through the trees, I could see the glow of a real fire. Our real campsite. I ran toward it, branches tearing at my clothes, and burst into the clearing to find David and Sarah sitting by the fire, sharing a thermos of coffee. They looked up in surprise as I stumbled toward them, bloody and torn and probably looking like a madman. "Michael?" Sarah stood up, concerned. "What happened to you? You look like you've been in a fight." I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could I tell them about the nightmare forest? The doppelgangers? The creature that had worn their faces? How could I explain that Jennifer was dead when she was sitting right there beside the fire, poking at the coals with a stick? "Where did you go?" David asked. "We woke up and your tent was empty." I looked around the campsite, trying to orient myself. Everything was exactly as it had been when we'd first arrived. Our tents in their proper places, the Jeep parked in the clearing, our supplies neatly arranged, as if the last few hours had never happened. I had a nightmare," I said finally. "Must have been sleepwalking." But I knew it hadn't been a dream. The cuts on my chest were real, and when I touched them, my fingers came away bloody. And somewhere out there in the forest, something was still hungry, still waiting. We broke camp at first light, all of us eager to leave the sandhills behind. As we loaded our gear into the Jeep, I caught Sarah looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Concern, maybe, or suspicion. "You sure you're okay?" she asked as David started the engine. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just want to get home." But as we drove away from Bone Creek, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, and in the rearview mirror I thought I saw something pale moving between the trees, something that might have been wearing Jennifer's face. We made it back to Omaha without incident, and on Monday morning we were all back at our desks as if nothing had happened. David seemed his usual nervous self, tapping his pen and fidgeting with paperwork. Sarah buried herself in case files, efficient and professional. Jennifer dealt with her divorce proceedings with the same bitter resignation she'd shown before the trip. But I knew the truth. I'd seen what lived in the sandhills, felt its hunger and malevolence, and late at night when I closed my eyes, I could still hear its laughter echoing through my dreams. The others didn't remember, or maybe they chose not to. Maybe the human mind simply couldn't hold on to that kind of horror and remain sane. But I remembered everything, and I knew that someday it would call me back. Because you can't really escape something that's marked you. You can only postpone the reckoning. 3 weeks after our camping trip, David didn't show up for work. His apartment was empty, his car gone. The police found no trace of him, no evidence of foul play. He'd simply vanished, as if he'd never existed at all. Sarah started taking long weekend trips, always alone, always to remote areas. She'd come back from these excursions changed somehow, quieter, more distant, and sometimes when she thought no one was looking, I'd catch her smiling that same too-wide smile I'd seen in the forest. Jennifer's divorce was finalized, but instead of relief, she seemed to grow more desperate, more hollow. She started staying late at the office, working cases that didn't exist, typing reports that disappeared from her computer every morning. And me? I started sleeping with all the lights on, because in the darkness I could see it waiting, that pale thing with the hungry eyes and the patient smile. It was still out there in the sandhills, feeding on lost campers and weekend hunters, still growing stronger, still waiting for me to come home, because I'd learned something in that nightmare forest, something the creature had whispered to me in the moments before I'd driven the branch through its chest. There is no escape from hunger. There is only the endless cycle of feeding and being fed upon, hunter and prey, marking and being marked. And somewhere in the Nebraska sandhills beside a creek called Bone Creek, something ancient and patient continues to wait for the next group of friends looking for adventure in the wilderness. It calls to them in their dreams, draws them with false promises of team building and bonding. But I know better now. I know that some hungers can never be satisfied, and I know that someday, when the marks on my chest start to burn again, I'll find myself driving back down Highway 83, following those tire ruts into the darkness. Because some prisons don't have walls. Some prisons are made of appetite. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near the Niobrara River in northern Nebraska, at a place the locals called Deadwood Creek. It was supposed to be a simple team-building weekend. Our marketing firm had been hemorrhaging employees, and our boss thought a camping trip would boost morale. 5 of us from different departments volunteered. Myself from marketing, Sarah Rodriguez from HR, David Jones from IT, Jennifer Williams from accounting, no relation despite the shared surname, and Robert Johnson from sales. Robert had suggested the location. He claimed his grandfather used to hunt in those parts, back when the timber was thick and the wildlife abundant. The drive took us 4 hours north from Omaha, through increasingly sparse farmland until we reached the edge of the Samuel R. McKelvey National Forest. The final 20 miles were on gravel roads that seemed to narrow with each turn, flanked by skeletal cottonwoods and prairie grass that whispered secrets in the October wind. "GPS signal's getting sketchy," David announced from the passenger seat, tapping his phone against the dashboard. "Says we should have arrived 10 minutes ago." "Paper maps, people," Robert laughed from behind me, his voice carrying that same dismissive tone he used in sales meetings. "Technology's made you all soft. My grandfather navigated these woods with nothing but a compass and his wits." Jennifer clutched her own phone in the back seat, her knuckles white. "Mine's showing we're in the middle of a lake. That can't be right." I glanced at my rearview mirror and caught the worry in her dark eyes. Jennifer had always been the anxious type, constantly checking and rechecking her spreadsheets, but something in her expression made my stomach tighten. The autumn sky was already dimming, casting long shadows between the trees that seemed to reach toward our vehicle like gnarled fingers. "There," Sarah pointed ahead, her voice steady and authoritative as always. "Looks like a clearing." The campsite Robert had chosen sat in a natural bowl surrounded by dense timber, with Deadwood Creek meandering along its eastern edge. The water moved sluggishly, almost black in the fading light, carrying the scent of decay and wet earth. Dead trees stood sentinel around the perimeter, massive cottonwoods killed by some long-ago drought, their bark peeling away like diseased skin. "Cheerful place," David muttered, adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses as he surveyed the scene. "Remind me why we didn't just go to a Holiday Inn?" "Because real experiences build real bonds," Sarah replied, already pulling camping gear from the trunk with practiced efficiency. "Besides, it's only 2 nights." As we set up camp, I noticed details that made my skin crawl. The silence was absolute. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, nothing but the wet whisper of the creek and the occasional groan of dead timber in the wind. The air itself felt thick, oppressive, carrying a metallic taste that coated the back of my throat. "Fire's not catching," Robert said, crouched over our makeshift fire pit. He'd arranged the kindling perfectly, exactly like his grandfather had taught him, but the flames kept guttering out despite the lack of wind. "Wood must be too green." Jennifer wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite her thick jacket. "It's getting cold fast. Wasn't supposed to drop below 50 tonight." I checked my phone for a weather update, but the screen showed only static where the weather app should be. No signal bars, no data connection. "Anyone else losing service?" David held his phone high, turning in a slow circle. "Nothing, not even emergency calls." His voice carried a slight tremor. "That's actually kind of weird. We're not that remote." "Relax," Robert said, finally coaxing a small flame to life. "My grandfather spent weeks out here without any contact with civilization, built character." The fire crackled weakly, producing more smoke than heat, and I noticed something odd about the flames themselves. They flickered between normal orange and an unsettling blue-green, like the fire was burning something other than wood. The smoke carried a smell that reminded me of burnt hair and spoiled meat. We cooked dinner over that strange fire, canned beans and hot dogs that tasted wrong, metallic and bitter. The conversation felt forced, punctuated by long silences where we all stared into the hypnotic, color-shifting flames. Jennifer barely ate, picking at her food while constantly glancing toward the tree line. "Tell us about your grandfather's hunting stories," Sarah suggested, clearly trying to lighten the mood. "You mentioned he knew these woods well." Robert's face brightened in the firelight, but there was something different about his expression, a glassy quality to his eyes that hadn't been there during the drive. Oh, he had stories all right. Used to say these woods were hungry. Said they'd take a man if he wasn't careful, change him from the inside out. Cheerful bedtime story, David said, but his attempt at humor fell flat. He stopped coming here after 1967, Robert continued, his voice taking on a distant quality. Said something had moved into these woods, something old and starving. Found his hunting partner 3 days after they'd separated, just standing in a clearing, staring at nothing. When he called out, the man turned around, but his eyes... Robert paused, staring deeper into the fire. His eyes were black as winter night, and he was smiling this terrible smile like he knew secrets about hunger that no man should know. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness, and Jennifer jumped. "Maybe we should call it a night," she suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. I was about to agree when we heard it. A sound from somewhere in the woods, like a child crying. It came from multiple directions at once, echoing off the dead trees in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. "Coyotes," Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. "They make all kinds of sounds." We extinguished the fire and retreated to our tents, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the night sounds, or rather, the absence of them. No insects, no night birds, nothing but the occasional crack of dead wood and a distant sound that might have been whispers in a language I didn't recognize. Sometime around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of someone moving around outside. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling our campsite. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the footsteps seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "David," I whispered toward his tent. "You hear that?" No response. The footsteps continued, closer now, and I could hear something else. A wet, snuffling sound like something large breathing through its nose. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag. The beam cut through the darkness outside my tent, illuminating nothing but empty space and the skeletal trees beyond. But in the brief moment before I clicked it off, I could have sworn I saw something pale moving between the trunks. Something tall and thin that moved wrong, like its joints bent in directions they shouldn't. Morning came gray and overcast, with a mist rising from Deadwood Creek that carried the smell of stagnant water and rotting vegetation. I emerged from my tent feeling like I hadn't slept at all, my nerves frayed and jumpy. David was already up, frantically tapping at his phone. "This is impossible," he muttered. "GPS is showing us in 3 different locations simultaneously, and look at this." He showed me his weather app, which was displaying a temperature of 40 degrees and a forecast that simply read "hunger" in repeating text. Jennifer stumbled from her tent, her hair disheveled and her face pale. Did anyone else have weird dreams? I dreamed I was walking through the woods, but I wasn't in control of my body. Something else was moving my legs, making me walk deeper and deeper. "Just stress dreams," Sarah said, but I noticed she was checking her own phone with increasing agitation. "Technology glitches. It happens in remote areas." "Where's Robert?" I asked, scanning the campsite. His tent was zipped shut and no sound came from inside. David knocked on the tent fabric. "Robert, you okay in there?" No answer. Sarah unzipped the tent flap and peered inside, then straightened with a confused expression. "Empty. Sleeping bags unzipped from the inside, but there's no sign of him." We searched the immediate area, calling his name, but the forest seemed to swallow our voices. The mist was getting thicker, reducing visibility to just a few yards, and the temperature was dropping despite the sun climbing higher in the sky. "We should head back to town," Jennifer said, her anxiety now openly visible. "Get help from the authorities." "Let's give it another hour," Sarah replied, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. He probably just went for a walk, got turned around in the mist. That's when we heard him, Robert's voice calling from somewhere deep in the woods. But it was wrong, somehow. The tone was flat, emotionless, like someone reading words they didn't understand. "Help," came the voice, but there was no urgency in it, no real distress. "Lost. Can't find way back." "That way?" David pointed toward a gap in the trees where the voice seemed to originate. "Come on." "Wait," I said, grabbing his arm. Something about Robert's voice was setting off every alarm bell in my head. Something's not right. He sounds... "Sounds what?" Sarah demanded. "Like he's reading from a script." We called back to him, and again that flat, emotionless response drifted through the mist. "Help. Lost. Can't find way back." The exact same words, in exactly the same tone. Jennifer was backing away from the tree line, her face white with terror. That's not Robert. That's not how people talk when they're actually lost. Despite my growing unease, we followed the voice deeper into the woods. The mist seemed to move with purpose, always staying just thick enough to limit our vision, and the dead trees closed in around us like the bars of a cage. The ground beneath our feet was spongy with decay, and more than once I felt my boots sink into something soft and yielding that I preferred not to examine too closely. We'd been walking for 20 minutes when we found him, standing perfectly still in a small clearing, his back to us. He was exactly as we'd left him. Same clothes, same posture, but something was fundamentally wrong with the scene. "Robert!" Sarah called out. "Thank God we were worried sick." He turned around slowly, too slowly, like his neck was stiff or unfamiliar. When he faced us, I felt my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It was Robert's face, but empty, like someone had scooped out everything that made him human and left only the shell. His eyes were black, not just the pupils but the entire visible surface, reflecting nothing. And he was smiling, a wide, horrible smile that showed too many teeth. "Found me," he said in that same flat tone. "Good. Very good." Jennifer made a small choked sound and stumbled backward. David was staring at Robert with the focused intensity he usually reserved for troubleshooting computer problems, as if he could debug whatever was wrong with our colleague. "Robert, are you feeling all right?" Sarah stepped forward, her HR training kicking in. "You look pale. Maybe you're dehydrated." "Feel fine," Robert replied, that terrible smile never wavering. "Better than fine. Feel hungry." The way he said that last word made my skin crawl. There was a weight to it, a significance that went beyond normal hunger. It sounded like anticipation, like a predator discussing prey. "We should head back to camp," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Get some food in you, something to drink." Robert nodded, still smiling, but he didn't move. He just stood there, watching us with those black, empty eyes. When we started walking back toward camp, he followed, but his movements were wrong. Too fluid, like he was floating rather than walking. The hike back seemed to take forever. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, Robert was there, maintaining the exact same distance, that smile fixed on his face like it had been painted there. The mist was getting thicker, and I was starting to lose track of direction. The dead trees all looked the same, their skeletal branches reaching toward us like arthritic fingers. "Are we going the right way?" Jennifer whispered, her voice barely audible. David checked his compass, then frowned and shook it. "North is that way. No. Wait." He turned the device in his hands, clearly frustrated. "This thing's spinning like a roulette wheel." "Technology fails," Robert said from behind us, and I spun around to find him much closer than he should have been. "But the old ways work. The old hunger works." "What the hell does that mean?" David snapped, his patience finally cracking. Robert's smile widened, if that was even possible. "Grandfather knew. Grandfather understood. Feed the woods, and the woods feed you." We finally stumbled back into our campsite as the afternoon light was beginning to fade. and I felt a wave of relief at seeing our familiar tents in the cold fire pit. But the relief was short-lived. Our campsite looked different, smaller somehow, as if the trees had moved closer while we were gone, and there was a smell in the air, sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a vase. "I'm making coffee," Sarah announced, clearly trying to restore some sense of normalcy. "Strong coffee, and then we're packing up and heading home." But when she went to the creek to get water, she let out a sharp cry. "The water, it's black, and it's moving wrong." I joined her at the creek's edge and immediately understood what she meant. The water wasn't just dark, it was thick, viscous, moving in patterns that had nothing to do with current or gravity. Shapes moved beneath the surface, large and writhing, occasionally breaking the surface with wet, slapping sounds. "We're not drinking from that," David stated flatly. "Doesn't matter," Robert said, and we all turned to look at him. He was standing by the cold fire pit, but he wasn't alone. There were shapes in the mist around him, tall and pale and moving in that same wrong way I'd glimpsed the night before. "You won't be thirsty much longer." That's when the screaming started. It came from Jennifer first, a sound of pure, animal terror that cut through the thick air like a blade. She was pointing at Robert, but not at Robert himself, at his shadow. In the dim afternoon light, his shadow was moving independently, reaching toward us with long, grasping fingers while Robert himself stood perfectly still. "Run!" Jennifer gasped, and then she was sprinting toward the tree line. The shadow lunged. I've never experienced terror like that moment when Robert's shadow detached itself from his body and came writhing across the ground toward us. It moved like liquid darkness, flowing over rocks and logs as if they weren't there, reaching out with appendages that shouldn't exist. David tried to grab a burning branch from our dead fire, but there was nothing there, just cold ashes and the lingering smell of that strange chemical smoke. Sarah was backing away, her eyes fixed on the approaching shadow, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "Don't let it touch you," Robert called out helpfully, still wearing that horrible smile. "It doesn't like to be touched, prefers to do the touching itself." I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the trees, following the path Jennifer had taken. Behind us, I could hear Robert laughing, not his normal laugh, but something that sounded like wind through a cave, hollow and echoing. The mist between the trees was so thick now that we could barely see 5 feet ahead. Jennifer's screams were getting fainter, coming from deeper in the woods, but they sounded wrong. Less like fear and more like something else, something that made my throat close up with dread. "This way," Sarah gasped, pulling me toward what she thought was the direction of our car. But every direction looked the same now, and the compass on David's phone was spinning wildly between different readings. We stumbled through the undergrowth for what felt like hours, calling Jennifer's name, but the only response was that wet, snuffling sound I'd heard the night before, circling us in the mist. The temperature continued to drop, and I could see my breath forming clouds that hung in the air longer than they should have. "There," David pointed ahead. "I see light." It was our campfire, burning brightly now with those same blue-green flames, but that was impossible. We'd left it cold, and standing beside it was Jennifer, perfectly still, her back to us. "Jennifer," Sarah called out. "Thank God, we thought—" Jennifer turned around and my heart stopped. Her face was Jennifer's face, but her eyes were the same black voids that Robert had developed, and she was smiling that same terrible smile as if she'd learned something wonderful and hideous. "Found me, too," she said in that flat, emotionless tone. "Good, very good." That's when I understood. Whatever was in these woods, whatever Robert's grandfather had encountered in 1967, it collected people, changed them, made them into something else while leaving just enough of the original to lure others into its trap. "The car," I whispered to Sarah and David. "We have to get to the car." But when we turned to run, Robert was there, blocking our path. and behind him, shapes were moving in the mist. Tall, pale figures that looked almost human until you saw the way their joints bent, the way their two long arms swayed as they walked. "Grandfather's stories were true," Robert said conversationally. "These woods are hungry, have been hungry for a very long time, but they're selective about what they eat." One of the pale figures stepped closer, and I could see it more clearly in the firelight. It had been human once. The basic shape was there, but it was wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with skin like birch bark and fingers that ended in points. Its face was the worst part. Human features stretched and distorted, with that same black-eyed smile. "They don't eat the body," Robert continued. "That would be wasteful. They eat the soul, the essence, the thing that makes you you, and they leave behind something new, something that serves their purpose." David made a break for the trees, but one of the pale figures moved with impossible speed, appearing in front of him before he'd taken 3 steps. It didn't attack him, it just touched his forehead with one elongated finger, and David froze. His eyes went black, and that horrible smile spread across his face. "David?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Very good," David replied in that same flat tone. "Found me, too." Sarah and I were backing toward the creek now, but I could hear splashing sounds from the black water, as if things were emerging from its depths. We were trapped, surrounded by our former colleagues and the pale things that had taken them. "What do you want?" I shouted at Robert, my voice cracking with desperation. "Want?" Robert tilted his head like a curious dog. Want is such a human concept. This is about need, about hunger that goes deeper than flesh, deeper than bone, about appetite that can never be satisfied. The pale figures were closing in now, moving with that same fluid motion, and I could smell them. The sweet rot of flowers and something else, something that reminded me of copper pennies and fresh graves. That's when Sarah did something unexpected. Instead of cowering or running, she stepped forward toward the nearest pale figure, her chin raised defiantly. "I know what you are," she said, her voice steady despite our circumstances. "My grandmother told me stories about things like you. Wendigo, flesh-eaters, soul-stealers." The pale figure stopped, its head tilting with interest. "You're parasites," Sarah continued. "You need human hosts because you can't exist on your own. You're not predators. You're scavengers, feeding on what others have built." Robert's smile faltered for the first time. "Grandmother's stories," he said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Grandmother wisdom," Sarah shot back. "She taught me how to recognize you, how to fight you, and most importantly, how to starve you." She pulled something from her pocket, a small cloth bag that smelled of sage and cedar. The pale figures recoiled as if she'd drawn a weapon. "Salt and iron filings," she explained to me without taking her eyes off the creatures. "Blessed by a Lakota medicine woman. My grandmother insisted I always carry it." The pale figures were backing away now, making sounds like static electricity and broken glass. Robert's face was contorting, his features shifting between human and something else entirely. "You think you understand," he snarled, his voice no longer flat but filled with rage. "You think your little bag of tricks can stop hunger that's existed since before your species learned to make fire?" "I think you're afraid," Sarah replied calmly, "and I think you should be." She opened the bag and threw its contents in a wide arc around us. Where the mixture hit the ground, the mist recoiled like a living thing, pulling back to reveal clear air and normal forest. The pale figures shrieked, a sound like nails on chalkboard, and began dissolving into smoke. But Robert didn't dissolve. Instead, he began to change, his human facade falling away like a shed skin. What emerged was something out of nightmare, tall as the dead trees around us, with flesh like rotting bark and eyes like holes in the world. Its mouth was filled with teeth designed for tearing, and when it spoke, the voice came from everywhere at once. "You delay nothing," It roared. "You save nothing. This place belongs to hunger now, and hunger always feeds." The thing that had been Robert lunged at us with claws like broken branches, but Sarah was already moving, pulling me toward a gap in the circle of salt and iron. We ran through the clear air, the creature's roars echoing behind us. But something was wrong. We weren't heading toward our car. We were going deeper into the woods, toward something that pulsed with its own malevolent light. "Sarah, where are we going?" I gasped, my lungs burning in the cold air. "The source," she replied, her jaw set with determination. "Whatever's feeding on this place, it has a heart. We find the heart, we kill the heart." The light was coming from a clearing ahead, but it wasn't natural light. It was the same blue-green glow as our corrupted campfire, pulsing like a heartbeat. As we got closer, I could see the source. A massive cottonwood tree, larger than any tree had a right to be, its trunk easily 20 feet across. But this tree was wrong. Its bark was pale and smooth, almost like skin, and its branches moved despite the absence of wind. And hanging from those branches were people. Dozens of them, suspended by what looked like organic cocoons, their faces peaceful as if they were sleeping. Some of the faces looked recent, but others were older, their features partially decomposed. "It's a nursery," Sarah whispered in horror. "It's keeping them alive, feeding on them slowly." That's when I saw him, David, suspended from a low branch, his eyes closed and a terrible smile on his face even in unconsciousness. And next to him, Jennifer, her body wrapped in the same organic material. "We have to get them down," I said, but Sarah grabbed my arm. "Look closer," she said. I did, and my stomach lurched. What I'd thought were cocoons were actually part of the tree itself, organic extensions that had grown through the victims' bodies, into their bodies. They weren't being held by the tree, they were part of it now. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, staring at the rows of human fruit. "Decades," Sarah replied. "Maybe centuries. This thing has been feeding on anyone who comes too close, adding them to its collection." The Wendigo's roar echoed through the forest, getting closer. We had minutes at most before it found us. "The salt and iron," I said desperately. "Will it work on the tree?" Sarah looked at her empty bag, then at the massive trunk. Not enough. Not nearly enough. That's when I remembered something. Robert's lighter, still in his abandoned jacket back at our campsite. But our campsite was in the opposite direction from the Wendigo's approach, and I wasn't sure we had time. "I have an idea," I told Sarah, "but you're not going to like it." I explained my plan quickly. The tree was dry despite its unnatural nature, and fire was still fire. If we could ignite it, the whole thing might burn, freeing the trapped souls and destroying whatever was feeding on them. "That's suicide," Sarah said flatly. "You'll never make it back to camp and here again before that thing catches up." "Then you'll have to distract it," I replied. "Lead it away from camp. Give me time to get the lighter." Sarah studied my face for a long moment, then nodded grimly. "If this doesn't work—" "It'll work," I interrupted, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "It has to work." Sarah took off through the trees, making as much noise as possible, calling out insults and challenges to the Wendigo. I waited until I heard its roars following her deeper into the forest, then sprinted back toward our campsite. The run back was a nightmare of low branches and hidden roots, but adrenaline kept me moving. Our campsite looked different in the strange blue-green glow emanating from the direction of the tree. Smaller, more cramped, as if the forest was slowly digesting it. Robert's jacket was where he'd left it, draped over a fallen log. I rifled through the pockets, my hands shaking, until I found the lighter. It was an old Zippo, probably his grandfather's, engraved with initials I couldn't make out in the dim light. The lighter flicked to life on the first try, producing a steady yellow flame that seemed like a beacon of normalcy in this twisted place. I stuffed it in my pocket and started back toward the tree, but I hadn't gone 10 steps when I heard Sarah scream. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was a scream of pain, raw and immediate. The Wendigo had caught her. I ran toward the sound, crashing through underbrush, but when I reached the clearing with the tree, there was no sign of either Sarah or the creature. Only the hanging victims, swaying gently in their organic bonds, and a thick trail of something dark leading away from the clearing. Following the trail led me to a smaller clearing where Sarah lay crumpled against the base of a dead oak, her left arm bent at an impossible angle. She was conscious but pale, her breathing shallow. "It's playing with us," she gasped when she saw me. "Wants us to think we have a chance." "Where is it now?" I asked, kneeling beside her. "Gone hunting," she replied. "Looking for more food, but it'll be back." I helped her sit up and we both looked back toward the pale glow of the tree. "The lighter?" I showed her the Zippo, and she smiled grimly. "Better make it count." Getting back to the tree took twice as long with Sarah leaning on me for support, but we made it. The hanging victims seemed more numerous now, as if the tree had been busy while we were gone. Or maybe I was just seeing them more clearly in the pulsing blue-green light. "The base," Sarah said, pointing to where the massive trunk met the ground. "That's where it'll burn hottest." I flicked the lighter to life and held it to a patch of the tree's bark. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the bark began to smolder, producing a thick, acrid smoke that made my eyes water. But the fire wasn't spreading. The bark was burning, but slowly, and I had the sick feeling that the tree was healing itself as fast as I could damage it. "It's not working," I said, panic creeping into my voice. "Your jacket," Sarah said suddenly. "Synthetic materials burn fast and hot. Use it as kindling." I shrugged off my jacket and pressed it against the burning bark, feeding more flames to the lighter. The synthetic material caught immediately, burning with intense heat and black smoke. The tree's bark began to burn in earnest now, and I could hear something like screaming coming from deep within the trunk. The flames spread faster than I'd expected, racing up the bark in spiral patterns that seemed to follow invisible pathways. The hanging victims began to convulse as the fire reached their organic bonds, and I realized with horror that they were waking up. All of them, all at once. Their screams filled the air as consciousness returned to bodies that had been slowly consumed for years or decades. Some of them were too far gone, their bodies more tree than human, but others were fighting against their bonds with desperate strength. "We have to help them," I shouted over the noise, but Sarah grabbed my arm. "Look," she said, pointing toward the tree line. The Wendigo was back, but it wasn't attacking. It was staring at the burning tree with what I could only describe as anguish, making sounds like a wounded animal. The flames were growing higher now, consuming the upper branches, and with each section that burned, the creature seemed to diminish. "It's dying," Sarah whispered. "The tree was its heart, its anchor to this place." The Wendigo turned its terrible gaze on us, and I saw something unexpected in those black eyes. Not hunger anymore, but fear. It took a step toward us, then another, but its movements were sluggish now, unsteady. "You have destroyed." It spoke in that voice like breaking glass. "Everything. Centuries of preparation, decades of careful feeding." "Good," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. The creature lunged at me with its last reserves of strength, claws extended, but the fire had spread too far. Its body was already beginning to dissolve, becoming smoke and shadow. Its claws passed through me harmlessly, and with a final anguished wail, it dispersed into the night air. The tree was burning in earnest now, a pillar of flame reaching toward the cloudy sky. Some of the victims were free, stumbling away from the inferno on legs that barely remembered how to walk. Others had been too long in the tree's embrace. Their remains crumbled to dust as the organic bonds burned away. Sarah and I retreated to a safe distance and watched the fire consume everything. The flames burned for hours, far longer than any normal fire should have, and when they finally died down, nothing remained but a circle of ash and a few charred stumps. The mist began to clear as the first pale light of dawn crept through the trees. and with it came the sounds of normal forest life. Birdsong, the rustle of small animals, the whisper of wind through healthy leaves. Our phones started working again, showing normal GPS coordinates and weather reports. We found our car exactly where we'd left it, though it felt like we'd been in those woods for weeks rather than 2 days. The drive back to civilization passed in a blur of familiar landmarks and the growing warmth of morning sun. The authorities found our campsite exactly as we'd described it, but there was no sign of Robert, David, or Jennifer. No organic residue, no circle of ash, no evidence of the tree or the fire. Just an ordinary clearing beside an ordinary creek, with ordinary dead trees that had succumbed to an ordinary drought years ago. They classified our colleagues as missing persons, presumed lost in the wilderness. Search and rescue teams combed the area for weeks but found nothing. Sarah and I told our story exactly as it happened, but we could see the skepticism in the investigators' eyes. 3 experienced hikers don't just vanish without a trace, they said. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe there was. Maybe what we experienced was some kind of shared hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. Maybe our colleagues simply got lost in the woods and succumbed to exposure or accident. Maybe the local wildlife disposed of the evidence before the search teams arrived. But I don't think so. I think we encountered something ancient and hungry that had been feeding on isolated travelers for generations. I think Robert's grandfather knew exactly what he was doing when he stopped hunting in those woods after 1967, and I think we were incredibly lucky to escape. Sarah's arm healed, though she still favors it on cold days. We both left the marketing firm within a month of our return. Some experiences change you, make it impossible to go back to the ordinary concerns of quarterly reports and team-building exercises. I think about our lost colleagues sometimes. Wonder if some part of them escaped when the tree burned. Wonder if they found peace or if they're still wandering in those woods, trying to remember who they used to be. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all. The only physical evidence I have of that weekend is Robert's lighter, the old Zippo that saved our lives. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling through the trees outside my apartment, I take it out and light it, watching the steady yellow flame dance in the darkness. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I can smell smoke that reminds me of burnt hair and spoiled meat, and I hear whispers in a language I don't recognize. My name is James Anderson, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote Sandhills region of Nebraska, near the Niobrara National Scenic River, where the endless grasslands give way to scattered patches of dark pine and the kind of silence that makes you question whether you're still on the same planet. We'd planned this camping trip for months. Michael Williams, my best friend since college, had been going through a rough divorce and needed to get away from everything. His girlfriend Sarah Rodriguez had suggested we make it a group thing, and my sister Jennifer Davis rounded out our party of 4. We were all in our late 20s, old enough to know better but still young enough to think we were invincible. The plan was simple. 3 days of camping and hiking in one of Nebraska's most remote areas, far from cell towers and civilization. Michael had found the spot on some obscure hiking forum, a hidden campsite along an unnamed tributary of the Niobrara River, accessible only by a barely maintained dirt road that branched off Highway 97 near Springview. I should have known something was wrong when my GPS started glitching 20 miles from our destination. The screen flickered between showing our location and complete static, occasionally displaying impossible coordinates that placed us somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Michael laughed it off from the passenger seat, saying it just proved we were really getting away from it all. "Look at this place," Sarah breathed from the back seat as we bumped down the increasingly narrow dirt road. "It's like the world just stops." She wasn't wrong. The rolling sandhills stretched endlessly in every direction, covered in prairie grass that whispered secrets in the wind. Isolated stands of eastern red cedar dotted the landscape like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching toward a sky that seemed impossibly vast and empty. We hadn't seen another human being, or even a building, for over an hour. The road finally petered out at what could generously be called a clearing, a flat patch of earth surrounded by a thick copse of cottonwoods and Russian olive trees. Beyond the trees, I could hear the gentle murmur of moving water. The Niobrara tributary was close, maybe 50 yards through the underbrush. "This is perfect," Jennifer said, stretching as she climbed out of my Jeep. "I can already feel my stress melting away." We set up our 2 tents in the fading afternoon light, Michael and Sarah sharing one, Jennifer and I each taking our own. The work felt good after hours of driving, and the familiar routine of hammering stakes and stretching rainflies was oddly comforting. By the time we had everything arranged, the sun was sinking behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. That first night passed without incident, though I remember lying in my sleeping bag and being struck by the absolute completeness of the silence. Growing up in Omaha, I was used to the constant background hum of civilization. Traffic, air conditioners, the distant rumble of trains. Here, the silence was so profound it seemed to have weight, pressing down on the thin nylon of my tent like something alive. I must have finally drifted off because I was awakened sometime before dawn by what sounded like Sarah crying. The sound was muffled but unmistakable. Deep, heartbroken sobs that seemed to go on forever. I lay there listening, wondering if I should go check on her, when the crying abruptly stopped. A few minutes later, I heard the zipper on their tent and quiet footsteps moving away from camp. In the morning, Sarah seemed fine. Better than fine, actually. She was practically glowing with good mood, humming while she made coffee over our camp stove. When I mentioned hearing her crying, she gave me a confused look. "Crying? I slept like a baby. Best night's sleep I've had in months." Michael backed her up. She was out cold all night, snoring like a chainsaw. He grinned and dodged the playful swat she aimed at his head. I let it drop, but something about her denial bothered me. The crying I'd heard had been too distinct, too close to have been anything else. Unless... Maybe it was an animal, Jennifer suggested when I mentioned it to her while we hiked down to the river that morning. Foxes can sound almost human when they're in distress. The river was beautiful, cutting a lazy path through stands of cottonwood and willow. The water was clearer than any I'd seen in Nebraska, clear enough to see trout darting between the rocks on the bottom. We spent the morning exploring, taking pictures and trying to forget the increasingly stressful world we'd left behind. It was around noon when things started to feel off. We were sitting on a fallen log, sharing a lunch of trail mix and jerky, when Sarah suddenly stood up and walked to the water's edge. She just stood there, staring into the current so still she might have been carved from stone. "Sarah?" Michael called. "You okay?" She didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear him. Michael got up and approached her slowly, like you might approach a sleepwalker you didn't want to startle. "Hey, babe." He touched her shoulder gently. Sarah blinked and turned around, that same bright smile lighting up her face. "Sorry, just lost in thought. This place is so peaceful." But her eyes looked different. Darker somehow, though the color hadn't changed. And when she smiled, it seemed to go on just a fraction of a second too long. The afternoon brought our first real sign that something was seriously wrong. We'd returned to camp to find our food supplies in complete disarray. Not scattered like an animal had gotten into them, but methodically rearranged. Someone, or something, had taken our canned goods and arranged them in a perfect circle around our cold fire pit, labels facing outward. Our fresh fruit had been placed in the center of the circle, and every piece was black with rot despite being perfectly fresh that morning. What the hell? Michael stared at the bizarre display. Who would do this? Maybe other campers playing a prank, Jennifer suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. We hadn't seen any sign of other people, and the nearest campground was at least 30 miles away. I knelt down and picked up one of the apples. It crumbled in my hands, the flesh soft and putrid, releasing a smell like death itself. Flies that shouldn't have existed in October swarmed up from the decay, buzzing angrily around my face. "We need to pack up and leave," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. "This isn't natural." But when we went to gather our gear, we discovered another problem. Michael's backpack was missing. We searched everywhere, the tents, the surrounding woods, even the riverbank. It had simply vanished, along with most of his personal items, including his wallet and car keys. "This is insane," he muttered, running his hands through his hair. "Backpacks don't just disappear." "Maybe you left it down by the river," Sarah suggested helpfully. Too helpfully. There was something about her tone that made my skin crawl, like she was reading lines from a script. We spent the rest of the afternoon searching, but found nothing. As the sun began to set, painting the sandhills in shades of red that suddenly seemed ominous rather than beautiful, we were forced to accept that we'd be staying another night. That evening, as we sat around a reluctant fire that kept trying to die despite the dry wood, Michael announced he was going to gather more firewood from the deadfall near the river. "I'll come with you," I offered, but he waved me off. "It's barely 100 yards. I'll be back in 10 minutes. I watched him disappear into the darkening trees, and that was the last time I saw the real Michael Williams. He was gone for 47 minutes. I know because I checked my watch obsessively, growing more worried with each passing minute. Jennifer had dozed off against my shoulder, and Sarah sat across the fire from us, staring into the flames with that same unsettling intensity she'd shown at the river. When Michael finally emerged from the tree line, my relief was immediate and overwhelming. He was carrying an armload of dead wood, whistling tunelessly under his breath. Everything seemed normal until he got close enough for me to see his face in the firelight. He was smiling. Not the easy, familiar grin I'd known for years, but something else entirely. Something that made every instinct I possessed scream warnings. The smile was too wide, stretching his lips in a way that looked almost painful. His eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's, and they never seemed to blink. "Sorry I took so long," he said, his voice perfectly normal except for a slight raspiness that hadn't been there before. "Got a little turned around in the dark." He dumped the wood near the fire and sat down next to Sarah, who immediately snuggled against his side. She seemed perfectly comfortable with whatever had come back from the woods wearing Michael's face. "You okay, man?" I asked, studying his features in the dancing light. "You look different." That horrible smile widened even further. "Never better. This place is amazing, James. Really amazing. You can feel the history here, you know? All the things that have happened in these woods over the years." Jennifer stirred against my shoulder, mumbling something in her sleep. The sound seemed to catch Michael's attention, and his head snapped toward her with predatory focus. For just a moment, his face looked hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. "Maybe we should all get some rest," I said carefully. "Big day of hiking tomorrow." "Sure," Michael agreed, but he didn't move. Neither did Sarah. They just sat there staring at us across the fire, and I realized with growing horror that they were perfectly synchronized, blinking at the exact same moment, breathing in the same rhythm, even tilting their heads at identical angles. I must have fallen asleep despite my unease, because the next thing I knew, Jennifer was shaking me awake in the gray pre-dawn light. Her face was pale with terror, and she was trembling so violently I could hear her teeth chattering. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Look." I followed her gaze to where Michael and Sarah's tent should have been. The tent was still there, but it was empty. Worse than empty. The sleeping bags were laid out perfectly, still zipped up, but they'd been opened from the inside. Clean, deliberate cuts ran along each zipper, as if someone had sliced their way out with surgical precision. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the footprints. Leading away from the tent, pressed deep into the soft earth, were 2 sets of tracks. But they weren't human tracks. They were something else entirely. Elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of each toe. The prints were too large, too distorted, as if whoever had made them had been walking on feet that weren't quite the right shape anymore. "We have to get out of here," Jennifer breathed. "Right now." I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. We moved quietly, stuffing our gear into our packs as quickly as possible. Every sound seemed impossibly loud in the morning stillness. The whisper of nylon, the click of buckles, our own ragged breathing. We were almost finished when we heard it. Laughter coming from somewhere in the woods. Not the warm, familiar sound of Michael's laughter, but something cold and alien. It echoed strangely among the trees, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "James?" The voice was definitely Michael's, but wrong somehow. Too cheerful, like a children's television host on amphetamines. "Jennifer? Where are you guys going?" I grabbed Jennifer's hand and pulled her toward the Jeep, praying my keys were still in my pocket. They were, but when I tried to start the engine, nothing happened. Not even a click. The dashboard was completely dark, as if someone had removed the battery. "James." The voice was closer now, maybe 50 yards away. "Come on, man. Don't be antisocial. Sarah and I want to show you something really cool." I popped the hood and immediately saw the problem. Someone had cut every wire under there, leaving a tangle of severed cables that looked like the aftermath of a bomb. The battery terminals had been twisted off entirely, probably with bare hands strong enough to bend metal. "The river," I whispered to Jennifer. "If we can get to the river, we can follow it downstream. Eventually, it has to lead to a road." We shouldered our packs and slipped into the woods, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. Behind us, I could hear Michael calling our names, his voice moving in a pattern that suggested he was circling our campsite like a predator testing a perimeter. The forest felt different in the gray morning light. The trees seemed denser, their branches intertwined overhead in a way that blocked out most of the sky. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, and more than once I spun around expecting to see something behind us, only to find empty air. We reached the river without incident and began following it downstream, picking our way carefully along the muddy bank. The water moved more slowly here, and it had taken on an oily, iridescent quality that made me think of pollution, though we were miles from any industrial development. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when Jennifer grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my bicep hard enough to bruise. "Listen," she whispered. I froze, straining my ears. At first, I heard only the gentle burble of the river and the whisper of wind through the grass. Then, gradually, I became aware of another sound. Footsteps moving through the woods parallel to our path. They were trying to be quiet, but whoever was making them was heavy enough that they couldn't avoid snapping the occasional twig or rustling through dry leaves. We picked up our pace, but the footsteps matched us stride for stride. They never got closer, but they never fell behind either. It was like being tracked by something that wanted us to know it was there. The sun was fully up now, but it didn't make me feel any safer. If anything, the daylight only made the wrongness more apparent. The shadows fell at impossible angles, and occasionally I caught glimpses of things moving between the trees that shouldn't have been there. Shapes that were almost human, but not quite, with limbs that bent in ways that made my eyes water to look at them. "James." Jennifer's voice was tight with fear. The footsteps stopped. She was right. The woods around us had fallen completely silent. Even the river seemed to be flowing more quietly, as if it too was holding its breath. That's when we heard Sarah singing. Her voice drifted through the trees, sweet and clear and absolutely terrifying. She was singing "Amazing Grace," but the melody was wrong, subtly distorted in a way that made the familiar hymn sound like a funeral dirge. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the water and the trees until I couldn't tell which direction it was coming from. "How sweet the sound," Sarah sang, her voice growing closer. "That saved a wretch like me." I looked at Jennifer and saw my own terror reflected in her eyes. Without speaking, we both began to run. The singing followed us, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes seeming to come from directly overhead. Sarah's voice was joined by another, Michael's, and together they turned the hymn into something obscene, a mockery of faith that made my skin crawl. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like rubber, and still the singing continued. The river began to curve away from us, forcing us to choose between staying near the water or plunging deeper into the woods. I chose the woods, hoping we could lose them in the thick undergrowth. That was a mistake. The trees closed in around us, and within minutes I realized we were completely lost. The forest had a maze-like quality that defied logic. Paths that seemed to curve back on themselves, clearings that looked exactly like ones we'd passed through before, trees with markings that I swear hadn't been there moments earlier. "I think we're going in circles," Jennifer panted, leaning against a cottonwood to catch her breath. I was about to agree when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Carved into the bark of the tree she was leaning against, still bleeding sap, was a message. "Welcome home." "Jennifer," I said quietly, "look up." She followed my gaze and gasped. Hanging from the branches above us, suspended by what looked like fishing line, were dozens of small bones. They swayed gently in the breeze, clicking together like wind chimes. Some looked like they might have come from animals, but others were definitely human. Small human bones. The kind that might come from fingers. "We need to move," I whispered. "Now." But when we turned to leave, Michael was standing 20 feet away, watching us with that terrible smile. His clothes were torn and dirty, and there were scratches on his arms that looked self-inflicted. But the worst part was his eyes. They weren't Michael's eyes anymore. They were the eyes of something that had never been human. "There you are," he said conversationally. "We've been looking everywhere for you." Sarah emerged from behind another tree, moving with a fluid grace that was completely at odds with her usual slightly clumsy gait. She was holding something in her hands, a small bundle wrapped in what looked like strips of bark. "We found something," she said, unwrapping the bundle. "Something that belongs to you." Inside the bark wrapping was Michael's missing backpack, but it had been altered. The fabric was stained with something dark and sticky, and there were holes torn in it that looked like bite marks. She held it out to us like an offering. "Go ahead," Michael encouraged. "Take a look inside. We've been keeping it safe for you." I didn't want to look, but some morbid curiosity compelled me to step forward. Jennifer grabbed my arm, trying to hold me back, but I gently pulled free. Whatever was in that backpack, I needed to see it. The zipper opened easily, too easily, as if the contents had been arranged for maximum impact. Inside, nestled among Michael's ruined clothes, was a collection of things that made no sense. Photographs that I'd never seen before, old black and white images of people who looked almost but not quite like us, standing in this exact same clearing. A journal written in handwriting that looked like Michael's but contained entries dating back decades, and at the bottom, wrapped in one of his t-shirts, in something soft and wet that I didn't want to identify. "It's a family reunion," Sarah said brightly. "We're all family here. We've been waiting so long for you to come home." Michael took a step closer, and I could smell him now. The sickly sweet scent of decay and something else, something animal and predatory. "James," he said, and his voice was like honey poured over broken glass. "Don't you remember? We grew up here. All of us. This is where we belong." The words triggered something deep in my memory. A sudden flash of images that couldn't possibly be real. A younger version of myself playing in these same woods. Jennifer laughing as she chased something through the trees, something that might have been Michael but had too many teeth. Sarah standing in the river, her dress floating around her like flower petals, her eyes completely black. "No," I said, backing away. "That's not... We grew up in Omaha. We met in college. You're not..." "Oh, but we are," Michael said, and now his smile was so wide it looked like his face might split in half. "We're your family, James. Your real family. The family that never leaves." That's when I realized what they were. What they'd always been, maybe. The thing wearing Michael's face. The thing that had taken Sarah. They weren't human. They were something else. something that fed on isolation and fear and the deep, primal terror of being truly alone. Wendigo. The word came to me unbidden, dredged up from half-remembered stories told around campfires. Creatures of endless hunger that took on the appearance of those they consumed, forever searching for more prey to feed their infinite appetite. But knowledge didn't make them any less terrifying. "Jennifer," I whispered without taking my eyes off the things that had been our friends. "When I say run, you run. Don't look back. Follow the river downstream no matter what you hear." "I'm not leaving you," she whispered back. "You have to. One of us needs to get out of here. One of us needs to tell people what happened." Michael's head tilted to one side like a curious dog. "Oh, but James, no one's leaving. This is a family reunion, remember? Families stay together." Sarah began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass that went on far too long. As she laughed, her appearance began to change. Her skin took on a grayish tint, and her fingers elongated into something resembling claws. Her mouth opened wider than any human mouth should be able to open, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Run," I said. Jennifer didn't hesitate. She bolted past me, crashing through the underbrush toward the sound of the river. The things that had been Michael and Sarah turned to watch her go, their heads moving in perfect synchronization. "Should we chase her?" Sarah asked, her voice now a wet, bubbling sound. "Let her run," Michael replied. "The woods are big, and she'll be back. They always come back." Then they both turned to look at me, and I saw my death in their eyes. Michael moved first, lunging toward me with inhuman speed. I threw myself sideways, rolling behind a fallen log just as his claws raked the air where my head had been. Sarah circled around to flank me, moving on all fours now, her back arched like a cat's. I grabbed a thick branch from the ground and swung it as hard as I could at Michael's approaching form. The wood connected with his skull with a wet crack, but instead of falling, he just laughed. Black blood ran down his face, and where it touched his skin, the flesh began to bubble and change. "You can't hurt us, James," he said conversationally. "We're family. Family protects family." Sarah pounced from my blind spot, her claws raking across my back and shredding my jacket. I screamed and stumbled forward, pain shooting through my body like electricity. I could feel warm blood soaking into my shirt. They were toying with me. They could have killed me already if they'd wanted to. Instead, they were drawing it out, savoring my terror like fine wine. I ran. The forest blurred around me as I crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear them following, their laughter echoing through the trees. They weren't running at full speed. They were pacing themselves, letting me think I had a chance. I burst out of the tree line onto the riverbank and saw Jennifer maybe 100 yards downstream. She was standing in the shallows, and for a moment my heart leaped with hope. Then I saw her face. She was smiling that same terrible smile. "James," she called, waving at me with fingers that were too long. "Over here. I found a way out." The things behind me stopped their pursuit, and I heard Michael's laughter again. "Told you she'd come back," he said. "They always do." I was surrounded. The river was to my left, the dark woods to my right, and the things that had been my friends closing in from front and behind. I had nowhere left to run. That's when I remembered something my grandfather had told me years ago, back when I was a kid and actually believed in monsters. He'd been full of old stories, half-remembered folklore from a childhood spent in rural communities where superstition was as real as the morning sunrise. "Iron," he'd said, "and fire. The old things, they can't abide iron and fire." I dug through my pockets desperately, looking for anything metal. My fingers closed around my car keys, not iron, but steel, which was close enough. The keychain had a small LED flashlight attached, and in my other pocket I found a lighter. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The thing wearing Jennifer's face took a step closer, still maintaining that horrible parody of my sister's appearance. "Come on, James, let's go home. We've got so much to show you." I flicked on the flashlight and held up the keys like a cross. which in retrospect was probably ridiculous. But something happened. The beam of light hit Jennifer's face, and for just a moment she flinched. It was barely perceptible, but it was enough to give me hope. "Stay back," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I know what you are." Michael laughed from behind me. Do you really? We're your family, James. We've always been your family. Those memories you think you have, those people you think you knew, they were just dreams. This is real. This has always been real." For a moment, doubt crept in. The false memories felt so vivid, so complete. Had I really grown up in Omaha? Had I really met Michael in college? The harder I tried to remember, the more the memories seemed to slip away like water through my fingers. But then I thought about the real Jennifer, my sister, the way she used to steal the marshmallows out of my Lucky Charms when we were kids, the time she broke her arm falling out of the tree in our backyard and I carried her to the house on my back, both of us crying, the way she looked in her wedding dress, radiant and happy and so alive. "No," I said, more firmly this time, I remember everything." The thing wearing her face snarled, the mask slipping for just a moment to reveal something underneath that was all teeth and hunger and ancient rage. That's when I made my move. I sprinted toward the river, not away from the Jennifer thing, but directly at her. She was so surprised that she didn't react in time. I tackled her around the waist, and we both went into the water with a splash that sent up a spray of icy droplets. The current was stronger than I'd expected, and colder. The shock of it drove the breath from my lungs and sent bolts of pain through my injured back. But something else happened, too. The moment the running water touched the thing I was wrestling with, it began to scream. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard, a shriek of pain and rage that seemed to come from every direction at once. The creature's grip on Jennifer's appearance began to slip, revealing glimpses of something that had never been human. Gray, mottled skin stretched over bones that were too long and bent at wrong angles. Eyes like black holes in a face that was more skull than flesh. I held on tight, using the current to carry us both downstream while the thing clawed and bit at me with inhuman strength. Its teeth found my shoulder, sending fresh waves of agony through my body, but I didn't let go. I couldn't let go. The water was saving me, somehow. Whatever these things were, running water was like acid to them. The creature's screams grew weaker, more desperate, and its struggles became less coordinated. Behind us, I could hear Michael and Sarah howling from the bank, but they didn't follow us into the water. They ran alongside the river for a while, keeping pace with the current, but gradually they began to fall behind. I held on to the Jennifer thing until its struggles stopped entirely and it began to dissolve in my arms, becoming something that might have been mist or might have been memory. Then I let the current carry me alone, clinging to a partially submerged log and trying not to think about how much blood I was losing. The river carried me for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. The sun was high overhead when I finally managed to pull myself onto a muddy bank near what looked like the remains of an old bridge. My clothes were soaked, my back was on fire with pain, and I was shivering uncontrollably. But I was alive. More importantly, I was no longer in the woods. The landscape around me was the familiar rolling grassland of the sandhills, dotted with the occasional farmhouse in the distance. I could see power lines and the faint ribbon of an actual road. I started walking. It took me 3 hours to reach the nearest farmhouse, a modest white structure surrounded by fields of corn stubble. The elderly farmer who answered my frantic knocking took one look at my condition and immediately called 911. I spent the next 2 days in the hospital in Valentine, getting stitched up and answering questions from police officers who clearly thought I was either lying or having some kind of psychological breakdown. They found our campsite, of course, found my Jeep with its cut wires and missing battery, found the strange circle of rotted food and the slashed tent. But they didn't find Michael, Sarah, or Jennifer. The official report listed them as missing persons, presumed dead, though no bodies were ever recovered. I tried to tell them what really happened, but who would believe such a story? Eventually, I learned to stick to a simpler version. We were attacked by unknown assailants, my friends were killed or kidnapped, and I escaped by jumping into the river. It wasn't entirely a lie, but sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling outside my apartment in Lincoln, I wonder if they really are dead. I wonder if they're still out there in those woods, waiting for the next group of friends or family to come camping in the sandhills. Still hungry, still hunting. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone on dark country roads, I see familiar faces in my rearview mirror. Michael's easy grin, Sarah's bright smile, Jennifer's loving eyes. They wave at me from the back seat, mouths moving as if they're trying to tell me something important. But I don't pull over. I don't turn around. I just keep driving, because I know that if I stop, if I listen to what they're trying to say, they'll convince me to come home. They'll remind me that family is forever, and forever is a very long time. The worst part is that sometimes, in my weakest moments, I almost want to go back. Because the truth is, I miss them. I miss my friends, my sister, the people they used to be before the woods took them and made them into something else. But I remember the taste of that river water, cold and clean and real. I remember the feeling of that thing dissolving in my arms, and the way the sunlight looked when I finally escaped those cursed trees. So I stay away from the sandhills. I stay away from remote places where the silence is too complete and the shadows fall at wrong angles. And when people ask me about camping or hiking or getting away from it all, I always find an excuse to decline. Because some families, once they claim you, never let you go. And deep in my heart, in the place where nightmares live, I know they're still waiting for me to come home. My name is Brian Wright, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Nebraska Sandhills, near the remote Calamus Reservoir, where the endless, grass-covered dunes stretch like a sea of whispers under an indifferent sky. Tyler, Bailey, and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We'd grown up together in Lincoln, but life had pulled us in different directions after college. Him to his insurance job in Omaha, me to construction work that kept me moving from town to town across the Midwest. This weekend was supposed to be our chance to reconnect, to remember who we were before bills and responsibilities and failed relationships ground us down into shadows of our former selves. "Man, look at this place," Tyler said as we pulled off Highway 183 onto a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. His beat-up Honda Civic bounced over the rutted track, our camping gear rattling in the back like bones in a medicine man's pouch. "It's like we're the only people left on Earth." He wasn't wrong. The sandhills in late October stretched endlessly in every direction, rolling hills of prairie grass that had turned the color of old bones bleached by countless summers. The sky was that particular shade of gray that promised either nothing or everything, heavy clouds hanging low enough that you felt you could reach up and touch them. The wind carried a sound like distant voices you couldn't quite understand, speaking in languages that predated human civilization. "GPS says we're about 10 miles from the reservoir," I said, checking my phone for what had to be the 15th time in the last hour. The signal kept flickering in and out, sometimes showing our location, sometimes placing us in empty white space as if we'd driven off the edge of the mapped world. "Should be plenty of good spots to set up camp." Tyler grinned, that same crooked smile he'd had since we were kids sneaking into Old Man Peterson's apple orchard on summer afternoons when the heat made everything shimmer like a mirage. "Remember when we used to think the scariest thing in the world was getting caught stealing apples? When the worst punishment we could imagine was having to explain ourselves to our parents?" I laughed, but something about the comment sat wrong in my stomach, like food that started to turn but hasn't quite gone bad yet. Maybe it was the way the grass seemed to bend toward our car as we passed, as if reaching for us with thousands of tiny fingers. Or how the few scattered trees looked twisted and wrong, like arthritic hands clawing at the sky in eternal supplication to gods that had long since stopped listening. The road, if you could call this rutted, barely there track a road, wound through the hills for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. Neither of us spoke much during that stretch. There was something about this place that discouraged conversation, as if words themselves were unwelcome here. The silence was broken only by the engine's labored breathing and the occasional squeak of the suspension as we hit another pothole. We drove for another 20 minutes before finding what looked like a decent campsite, a small clearing near a copse of cottonwoods about half a mile from the reservoir's edge. The water glinted dully through the trees, reflecting the overcast sky like a mirror made of tarnished silver. I could hear it lapping against the shore with a sound like wet whispers, like the lake was trying to tell us secrets we didn't want to know. "This'll do," Tyler said, parking and stretching as he got out. The silence that replaced the engine noise was so complete it felt physical, pressing against our eardrums like cotton. Nice and isolated. No cell towers, no neighbors, no... He stopped mid-sentence, and I followed his gaze. There, carved into the bark of the largest cottonwood, was a symbol I didn't recognize. A circle with what looked like stick figures dancing around it, their arms raised to the sky in what might have been celebration or supplication. The carving was old, the bark grown thick around the edges, but something about it made my skin crawl. The figures seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, shifting and writhing in my peripheral vision. "Probably just some kids messing around," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to me. The words felt forced, artificial, like lines from a play I'd never auditioned for. "Yeah," Tyler agreed, but he kept staring at the tree. His face had gone pale, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "Probably." We spent the next hour setting up camp, and with each passing minute, the sense of wrongness grew stronger. Our tent stakes seemed to bend and twist no matter how carefully we drove them into the ground, as if the earth itself was rejecting our presence. The hammer felt heavier than it should have, and my arms ached after just a few swings. The wind carried sounds that might have been voices, might have been just the grass rubbing together, but which whispered our names just quietly enough that we couldn't be sure we'd really heard them. Tyler was having trouble with his sleeping bag, the zipper catching and sticking no matter how gently he tried to work it. "This damn thing worked fine when I tested it at home," he muttered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. "It's like everything's fighting us today." "Equipment gets weird sometimes," I said, though I was having my own problems. My backpack straps had somehow tangled themselves into an impossible knot, and my camp stove kept refusing to light despite the fact that I'd checked the fuel tank twice. Every time I looked up, that symbol on the tree seemed to be watching us, the carved figures appearing to dance just out of focus. By the time we had our camp set up, such as it was, with our tent listing slightly to one side and our gear scattered around in a way that looked more like the aftermath of a violent windstorm than organized camping, the sun was beginning to set. The dying light painted the hills the color of dried blood, and long shadows stretched across the grass like grasping fingers. Tyler was building a fire while I arranged our food stores in the bear-proof container we'd brought, though I couldn't remember the last time anyone had seen a bear in this part of Nebraska. The idea seemed almost laughably optimistic now, as if bears were the worst thing we might encounter in this place. "You know what's weird?" Tyler said, striking a match. The flame flared bright yellow, then immediately died as if snuffed by invisible fingers. "I keep feeling like we've been here before, like specifically here, not just somewhere similar, this exact place." I paused in my unpacking, a can of beans halfway to the container. He was right. There was something familiar about this place, something that tugged at memories I couldn't quite reach. The way the hills rolled away from us in that particular pattern, the specific angle of the trees, even the smell of the water carried on the wind. It all felt like déjà vu stretched into nightmare territory. "Must be all those camping trips when we were kids," I said, trying to shake off the feeling. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. This was different. This was specific. "One campsite looks pretty much like another, right?" Tyler struck another match. This time it caught, but the flames that licked up from the kindling were the wrong color. Not the warm orange and yellow you'd expect, but a sickly green that hurt to look at directly, like staring into infected flesh. We both stared at it for a long moment, neither of us willing to acknowledge what we were seeing. "Must be the wood," Tyler said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Some kind of mineral in it or something. Copper, maybe. That can turn flames green." The fire gradually shifted to normal colors, but I noticed Tyler was avoiding looking directly at it. We cooked our dinner, canned chili heated over the flames, in relative silence, both lost in our own thoughts. The food tasted wrong, too metallic, like blood mixed with sand. Every bite felt like swallowing guilt. As full darkness fell, the sounds began. At first, it was just the wind in the grass, the normal creaking of trees, the distant splash of water against the shore. But gradually, other sounds crept in. A rustling that was too purposeful to be random, too organized to be natural. There was a low humming that seemed to come from underground, vibrating up through the soles of our feet and into our bones. And occasionally, what sounded like voices calling from very far away, their words just out of reach but their tone unmistakably urgent. "Brian," one of them seemed to whisper. "Tyler." "You hear that?" Tyler asked, his voice tight with poorly controlled fear. He was gripping his coffee mug so hard his knuckles had gone white. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The voices were clearer now, definitely calling our names, but when we tried to pinpoint the direction, they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the very air around us was speaking. "Probably just other campers," I said, though I knew there were no other cars for miles. We'd seen the road we'd taken, and there had been no turnoffs, no other tire tracks in the dirt. "Sound carries weird out here. Could be people on the other side of the reservoir." Tyler was staring out into the darkness beyond our fire's reach, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Did you see that?" "See what?" "Something moving out there, like someone walking, but wrong somehow. Too tall, or too thin, or—" He shook his head, unable to finish the thought. I followed his gaze but saw nothing except the endless grass swaying in the wind. But now that he'd mentioned it, I could feel eyes on us. That prickly sensation of being watched by something that didn't want to be seen, something that was studying us with the patience of a predator sizing up its prey. We tried to continue our conversation, to recapture the easy camaraderie we'd shared on the drive up, but the words felt forced, artificial. Every few minutes one of us would glance over our shoulder or peer into the darkness, searching for the source of our growing unease. The fire popped and crackled, but even those familiar sounds seemed muted and wrong, as if the flames were burning underwater. "Remember Danny's camping trips?" Tyler asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't thought about my older brother in months, hadn't allowed myself to think about him. Danny had been 17 when he disappeared, Tyler and I just 12. It had been during a camping trip, actually, though not to this place, or so I'd always believed. "Tyler," I said slowly, "why did you bring that up?" He was staring into the fire, his face pale and drawn. "I don't know, this place reminds me of that trip, the one where—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We both knew how that story ended, with search parties and police dogs and my parents' marriage falling apart under the weight of their grief. Danny and his friend Marcus had simply vanished, leaving behind only their sleeping bags and a cold campfire. "That was different," I said firmly. "That was up north, near the Niobrara. This is completely different." But even as I said it, doubt was creeping in. The memories from that time were fuzzy, confused by trauma and the natural way a 12-year-old's mind processes devastating loss. Had it really been near the Niobrara? Or was that just what I'd told myself over the years, because the truth was too painful to remember? Around midnight, Tyler announced he was going to take a walk to the reservoir to wash up before bed. "I'll come with you," I said immediately, surprised by the urgency in my own voice. "Nah, it's fine. Just gonna splash some water on my face, maybe take a leak. Be right back." His voice had an edge to it I'd never heard before, something sharp and brittle that made my skin crawl, something cold settled in my stomach, a weight like swallowed stones. "Tyler, I really think we should stick together. This place is giving me the creeps." "Dude, relax." The edge in his voice was sharper now, almost angry. "It's like 50 yards. What's going to happen? You think the bogeyman's going to get me?" Before I could argue further, he grabbed his flashlight and disappeared into the darkness. I sat by the fire, counting the seconds, listening to his footsteps fade away. The beam of his flashlight bobbed through the trees for a moment, then vanished entirely. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no water sounds, no insects. Just a pressing, expectant quiet that made my ears ring and my heart pound. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. "Tyler!" I called out, my voice swallowed immediately by the darkness. "Tyler, you okay?" No response, not even an echo. I grabbed my own flashlight and headed toward the reservoir, following the rough path Tyler had taken. My hands were shaking so badly the beam jumped and wavered, creating more shadows than it illuminated. Every few steps I called Tyler's name, but the sound just died in the air as if the night itself was absorbing it, swallowing my words before they could travel more than a few feet. The path to the reservoir was longer than I'd expected, winding through the cottonwoods and over a small rise before dropping down to the water's edge. Strange formations of driftwood lined the shore, or at least I hoped it was driftwood. In the darkness, with only my flashlight for illumination, they looked disturbingly like bones, like the rib cage of some enormous beast that had died here long ago. I found him standing at the water's edge, perfectly still, his back to me. He was about 10 feet from shore, standing in water that came up to his waist. His flashlight lay on the beach behind him, still on but pointing uselessly at the sky. "Jesus Christ, Tyler. I've been calling you for 20 minutes. Why didn't you answer?" He didn't move, didn't acknowledge that I'd spoken, didn't even seem to be breathing. I waded into the water toward him, the cold lake soaking through my boots and up my legs. The bottom was soft and muddy, and I had to fight not to think about what I might be stepping on. "Tyler," I called again when I was close enough to touch him. "Dude, what's wrong?" I walked around to face him, and my blood turned to ice water. It was Tyler. Same clothes, same face, same sandy brown hair that he'd been threatening to cut for months but never quite got around to. But something fundamental was wrong. His eyes were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible eye, like looking into deep water at night when you can't see the bottom. And he was smiling, but it was too wide, stretching his face in ways that shouldn't have been possible, like someone had taken a knife to the corners of his mouth and carved the expression permanently into his flesh. "Tyler?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. "Tyler's not here right now," the thing wearing my friend's face said, and its voice was Tyler's voice but wrong, like hearing a recording played backwards and then forwards again, all the familiar inflections twisted into something alien and hungry. "But he'll be back soon. We just needed to borrow him for a while." I stumbled backward, water splashing around my legs, my flashlight shaking so badly the beam danced across Tyler's impossible smile like a strobe light. What the fuck? What the fuck is happening? The Tyler thing tilted its head at an impossible angle. Like a bird studying an insect it was considering whether to eat. The movement was too sharp, too quick, accompanied by a sound like breaking twigs. "Don't you remember this place, Brian? Don't you remember what happened here?" And suddenly, horribly, I did. The memories came flooding back like water through a burst dam. Memories I'd somehow blocked out completely, buried so deep I'd convinced myself they were just nightmares. We were 12 years old, Tyler and me, camping with my older brother Danny and his friend Marcus. This exact spot, this exact campsite, even the same symbol carved into the same tree. Danny and Marcus had gone to get firewood just as dusk was falling, laughing and joking as they disappeared into the trees. They never came back. But Tyler and I hadn't just waited by the fire all night like I'd told the police, like I'd told my parents, like I'd told myself for 17 years. We'd gone looking for them when they didn't return after an hour, and we'd found them. We'd found them being dragged into the lake by things that looked like people but moved wrong, bent wrong, smiled wrong, pale figures with 2 long limbs and eyes like black water. Danny had been screaming, trying to fight them off, but his voice had been getting fainter and fainter as they pulled him deeper into the dark water. Marcus was already gone, his body floating face down near the shore, his neck bent at an angle that made it clear he'd never speak again. Tyler and I had hidden in the tall grass, too terrified to move, too terrified to help, too terrified to do anything but watch as our brothers were taken by things that shouldn't have existed. We'd watched until the lake went still again, until there was nothing left but ripples and silence and the smell of decay that clung to the water like a curse. "You remember now," the thing said, and Tyler's familiar features twisted into something alien and hungry. "You've always remembered, deep down in the dark places where you keep the things that hurt too much to look at." "Let him go," I managed to say, though my voice was barely a croak. The words felt thick in my mouth, like trying to speak through mud. "Oh, we will, eventually, when we're done with him, when there's nothing left that's useful." The thing that looked like Tyler began walking toward me, moving in that same loose-limbed way Tyler always had, but somehow wrong, like a marionette being controlled by someone who'd only heard puppet movement described secondhand. "Your brother lasted 3 days before he stopped screaming. His friend was sweeter, younger, but you two, you're fully grown now, aged properly. You'll last us much longer." It reached for me with fingers that were too long, joints that bent in too many directions, nails that had grown into something closer to claws. I turned and ran, crashing through the water and up onto the shore, my boots squelching in the mud as I fought for purchase on the slippery bank. I crashed through the grass and trees, branches tearing at my face, my flashlight beam swinging wildly as I stumbled and fell and got up and ran some more. Behind me, I could hear it following, not hurrying, just walking steadily through the darkness with that horrible parody of Tyler's gait. It was singing now, or humming, a tune I didn't recognize but which filled me with such deep, primal terror that I almost vomited as I ran. When I reached our campsite, I dove for the tent and grabbed my cell phone. No signal, of course. The display showed absolutely nothing, not even the ghost of a bar. But I tried anyway, dialing 911 over and over while my hands shook so badly I could barely hit the numbers. The phone felt wrong in my hands, heavier than it should have been, and when I looked at the screen more closely, I realized the numbers weren't making sense. Instead of digits, strange symbols were appearing, the same dancing figures from the tree, multiplying across the display like an infection. "Brian!" Tyler's voice called from just outside the ring of firelight. "Brian, what's wrong? Where did you go?" I peered out through the tent flap. Tyler stood at the edge of our camp looking perfectly normal. His eyes were the right color, his smile was the right size, his head was tilted at a perfectly human angle. His clothes were dry, as if he'd never been in the water at all. "Tyler?" I called tentatively, my voice cracking like a teenager's. "Yeah, man, it's me. I went to the water and you weren't there when I got back. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." His voice was warm, concerned, exactly like the Tyler I'd known for most of my life. I studied his face in the firelight, searching for any sign of the wrongness I'd seen by the reservoir, but this was just Tyler, my best friend since childhood. The guy who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me cheat on my algebra final and been the best man at my wedding before Sarah and I divorced. The guy who'd brought me ice cream when I had my wisdom teeth out, who'd helped me move 4 times without complaint, who'd listened to me cry about my dad's cancer diagnosis without judgment. I thought something happened to you," I said, emerging from the tent on unsteady legs. "You were gone for so long, and I went to look for you, and you were in the water, and—" The words died in my throat. How could I possibly explain what I'd seen? How could I make him understand without sounding completely insane? Tyler frowned, his expression shifting to one of genuine concern. I was only gone for like 5 minutes. Dude, you must have dozed off or something. Maybe had a bad dream. But I knew that wasn't true. I'd been wide awake, counting every second, and Tyler had been gone for at least 40 minutes. I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped. The way Tyler was looking at me, concerned but also slightly annoyed, like he was dealing with a friend who'd had too much to drink and was starting to embarrass himself, was so perfectly normal that I began to doubt my own memories. Had I fallen asleep by the fire? Had I dreamed the whole encounter by the water? But my boots were still wet. My pants were soaked to the knee, and I could still taste the metallic flavor of fear in my mouth, could still feel the phantom touch of those 2 long fingers reaching for me in the darkness. "Yeah," I said finally, my voice hollow. "Maybe you're right. This place is just... it's getting to me, I guess." "Want to call it a night?" Tyler asked, and his voice carried a note of genuine kindness that made me want to weep with relief. "We can head back first thing in the morning if you want. I know you've been stressed about work lately, and maybe being out here isn't helping." Part of me wanted to say yes, to pack up immediately and drive back to civilization, back to a world that made sense and followed rules I understood. But a larger part was embarrassed by my reaction, by the way I'd panicked over what was probably just fatigue and an overactive imagination fueled by too many horror movies and not enough sleep. "Nah, we drove all this way. Let's at least stay the one night." Tyler smiled, that same crooked grin I'd known for decades, and clapped me on the shoulder. His hand felt warm and solid and real. "That's the spirit. Besides, nothing to be afraid of out here except maybe some coyotes, and they're more scared of us than we are of them." We banked the fire and crawled into our respective sleeping bags. Tyler fell asleep almost immediately, his breathing deep and regular, occasionally punctuated by the small snorts and mumbles that had been part of his sleep pattern since we were kids having sleepovers in my basement. But I lay awake staring at the tent ceiling and listening to the sounds of the night. Every rustle of grass, every creak of trees, every distant splash from the reservoir made me tense. The wind had picked up, and it carried new sounds now. Voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. Laughter that went on too long and ended too abruptly. Music that seemed to come from underground. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I heard Tyler get up. I lay perfectly still, listening to the whisper of his sleeping bag, the soft rustle of him putting on his shoes. The tent zipper opened with its characteristic metallic rasp, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Tyler," I whispered, "where are you going?" No answer. I heard his footsteps moving away from the tent, heading back toward the reservoir. This time, they sounded different. Heavier than usual, but also somehow wrong, like he was walking on the balls of his feet or dragging something behind him. This time, I wasn't waiting. I grabbed my flashlight and followed immediately, not bothering with shoes or jacket. The grass was wet with dew that soaked through my socks, and the air was cold enough to make my breath visible in the beam of my flashlight. I found him in the same spot as before, standing motionless at the water's edge. But this time, I could see what he was looking at. There were others in the water, pale figures standing waist-deep in the dark lake, their faces turned toward shore. As I watched, more figures emerged from the deeper water, moving slowly toward land with that same wrong gait I'd seen Tyler use. They were the remains of campers and hikers who had disappeared over the years, but they weren't quite corpses and they weren't quite alive. Their clothes hung in tatters, their skin was pale and bloated, but they moved with purpose. Their eyes reflected the moonlight like those of nocturnal animals, and when they opened their mouths, I could see that their teeth had grown into something closer to fangs. "Tyler," I said urgently, my voice barely a whisper. "Tyler, we need to go. Right now." He turned toward me, and his face was wrong again. Not black eyes this time, but something worse. His features were shifting, melting and reforming like clay in warm hands. Sometimes it was Tyler's face, sometimes it was my brother Danny's, Sometimes faces I didn't recognize at all. Victims from years past, decades past, all of them trapped in this thing that wore their appearances like masks. "We've been waiting for you to come back," the thing said in a voice that was a chorus of whispers, dozens of voices speaking in unison. "All these years, we've been waiting. We knew you'd return eventually. They always do." The figures in the water were getting closer now, and I could see the full extent of what they'd become. Some were missing limbs, others had limbs that weren't quite human anymore. One figure near the shore had grown gills along its neck, while another had fingers that had elongated into webbed appendages. They were changing, adapting to their new environment, becoming something that belonged neither to land nor water, but to the space between life and death. "This is where people go when they get lost," the Tyler thing continued, its face cycling through expressions I recognized. Tyler's confused frown, Danny's defiant glare, Marcus's easy smile. "This is where the missing end up. And now you get to join them. You get to become part of something larger, something that's been here since before your ancestors learned to make fire." It lunged for me then, moving with inhuman speed and strength. I barely managed to dodge, stumbling backward as its fingers, too long now, ending in ragged nails that looked like they'd been gnawed rather than cut, swiped through the air where my head had been. The movement displaced enough air that I felt the wind of its passage against my cheek. I ran again, but this time I had a destination in mind. Our car was still parked by the campsite, and if I could reach it, if the keys were still in Tyler's pocket, maybe I could escape this nightmare and get help. Maybe I could call the police, the National Guard, anyone who might believe my story and come back here with flamethrowers and bulldozers to clean out this infection before it spread. I crashed through our camp, scattering gear as I searched frantically for the car keys. Behind me, I could hear the Tyler thing approaching, along with the wet, shuffling sounds of the things from the lake. They were moving faster now, excited by the prospect of fresh prey, and I could hear them calling to each other in voices that sounded like drowning. The keys weren't in our tent, weren't by the fire ring, weren't anywhere I could see in the brief seconds I had to search. Then I remembered. Tyler always kept them in his jacket pocket, and his jacket was hanging on a branch near the edge of our camp. But as I reached for it, the Tyler thing emerged from the darkness, and its face had settled back into Tyler's familiar features. It was perfect now, exactly like my friend, except for the black water dripping from its clothes and the pale, unnatural glow of its skin in the firelight. "Looking for these?" it asked, holding up the car keys with one finger that was just slightly too long to be human. I backed away until I felt the rough bark of the cottonwood tree against my spine. The carved symbol seemed to burn against my back through my shirt, and suddenly I understood what it meant. It wasn't stick figures dancing. It was bodies hanging, strung up as offerings or warnings or both. A feeding schedule etched in bark, marking the times when the hungry things could rise from the water to collect their due. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Just let me go. I won't tell anyone. I'll forget this ever happened." The thing wearing Tyler's face laughed, a sound like water gurgling down a drain, like the last breath of a drowning man. "But we can't let you go, Brian. You know too much now. You remember. And besides, you've been marked since you were 12 years old. Did you really think you could run away from this forever?" The memories were flooding back now, all the details I'd somehow suppressed for 17 years. Danny and Marcus hadn't just disappeared. I'd seen them taken, dragged into the lake by pale hands while Tyler and I hid in the tall grass, too terrified to help, too terrified to run, too terrified to do anything but watch and remember. We'd sworn never to tell anyone what we'd really seen, had convinced ourselves it was just a nightmare, just trauma making us imagine impossible things. But deep down, we'd always known the truth. We'd always known we'd escaped something that night, something that wouldn't forget us, something that would be patient enough to wait for us to return. "Your brother tasted like copper and fear," the Tyler thing said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "His friend was sweeter, younger. But you two, you're fully grown now. aged properly, you'll last us much longer than they did." It reached for me again, and this time I couldn't dodge fast enough. Its fingers closed around my throat, cold as lake water, strong as steel cables. I clawed at its hands, trying to break free, but it was like fighting a machine made of ice and hatred. Black spots began to dance at the edges of my vision, and I could feel consciousness slipping away. Then, impossibly, I heard Tyler's voice. Not the thing's chorus of whispers, but Tyler's real voice, faint and distant, coming from somewhere inside the creature holding me. "Brian," he gasped, his words barely audible over the sound of my own choking. "Brian, I'm still in here. You have to… the symbol. Break the symbol." With the last of my strength, I twisted around and slammed my fist into the carved symbol on the tree. The wood was harder than I'd expected, and pain shot up my arm as my knuckles split against the bark. But something cracked. Not just the wood, but something else. Something that felt like breaking a chain that had been wrapped around this place for decades. The creature shrieked, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the cry of a dying animal, and its grip loosened just enough for me to break free. I hit the symbol again and again, until my knuckles were bloody and the carving was nothing but splinters and torn bark. With each blow, the Tyler thing convulsed, its form becoming less stable, less human. "You're breaking the connection," Tyler's real voice said, stronger now, more distinct from the chorus. "Keep going, don't stop." The things from the lake were almost upon us now, their wet, shuffling footsteps getting closer. But I kept pounding at the tree until the symbol was completely destroyed. The carved circle and its dancing figures were reduced to nothing but wood pulp and my own blood. And as the last piece fell away, something changed in the air around us. The Tyler thing let out one final shriek and collapsed, its body hitting the ground with a wet thud that splashed mud and lake water in all directions. For a moment, everything was silent except for my ragged breathing and the frantic beating of my heart. Even the creatures from the lake had stopped moving, standing frozen like statues in the sudden stillness. Then Tyler groaned and sat up, his eyes their normal brown color, his face entirely human again. He looked around in confusion, taking in the destroyed campsite, the approaching figures from the lake, and my bloody hands. "Jesus Christ," he gasped, his voice hoarse but recognizably his own. "What the hell happened? I feel like I've been underwater for hours. I can't remember anything after going to the lake the first time." I helped him to his feet, both of us shaking so badly we could barely stand. The creatures from the lake were beginning to move again, but slower now, as if the destruction of the symbol had weakened them somehow. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing his arm. "Right now, before they figure out what's happening." Tyler didn't argue. We threw our gear into the car with record speed, not bothering to properly pack anything or even put out the fire. The creatures were getting closer, their movements becoming more coordinated, more purposeful. As we jumped into the car, I could see them clearly for the first time, the bloated, pale things that had once been human, their eyes reflecting our headlights like animals caught in the beam. The engine turned over on the third try, and we tore out of there, our tires spinning in the soft earth before finally finding purchase. As we drove away, I could see pale figures standing in our abandoned campsite, watching us go with eyes that held too much intelligence, too much malice, too much patience. We drove in silence until we reached the highway, both of us too shaken to speak. It wasn't until we saw the lights of Burwell in the distance that either of us felt safe enough to try putting words to what we'd experienced. "Did that really happen?" Tyler asked, his voice hoarse and uncertain. I looked at my bloody knuckles, at the tears in our clothes, at the haunted expression in Tyler's eyes that I knew was mirrored in my own. There was mud from the lake bottom on our shoes, and when I checked the rearview mirror, I could see scratches on my face from running through the trees. "Yeah," I said quietly. "It really happened. Just like when we were kids. Just like when we were kids." We drove through the rest of the night, neither of us wanting to stop until we were back in civilization, back in a world of streetlights and cell phone towers and people who had never seen the things we'd seen. We didn't talk about it during the drive, didn't try to make sense of it or rationalize it away. Some experiences are too big for words, too terrible for the mind to process immediately. We never talked about what we'd experienced that night. Tyler moved to Colorado 6 months later, claiming he needed a change of scenery, needed to get away from the memories. I threw myself into work, taking jobs that kept me traveling, kept me moving, anything to avoid thinking about what we'd seen in the sandhills. But sometimes, in the dead of night when the wind is blowing just right, I can still hear voices calling my name from far away. And sometimes I wake up with the taste of lake water in my mouth and the feeling that something with 2 long fingers has been touching my face while I sleep. Sometimes I dream about that symbol, about the dancing figures that were really hanging bodies, and I wonder how many other places like that exist in the world. I have never been camping since. I don't think I ever will again, because I know now that some places are hungry, and they never forget. They mark you when you're young and vulnerable, and they wait with the patience of geological time for you to return. And, somewhere in the Nebraska sandhills near a reservoir that doesn't appear on any current maps, pale figures still wait in dark water for the next group of campers to arrive. They're patient, they have all the time in the world, and they're always, always hungry. My name is David Jones, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Samuel R. McKelvey National Forest, deep in the heart of Cherry County, Nebraska, where 116,000 acres of grassland and scattered woodlands stretch endlessly beneath an indifferent sky. Michael Williams and I had been best friends since college, bonded by our shared love of the outdoors and our mutual need to escape the suffocating monotony of our office jobs in Omaha. We'd been planning this backpacking trip for months, 3 days of hiking through the remote sections of McKelvey, where you could walk for hours without seeing another soul, the kind of place where cell towers were a distant memory, and the only sounds were wind through grass and the occasional cry of a red-tailed hawk. I should have known something was wrong when my phone died before we even reached the trailhead. Not the battery. The whole device just went dark, like something had sucked the life right out of it. Michael laughed it off, said it would be good for us to disconnect completely. His phone was working fine, he said, though I noticed he kept it buried deep in his pack and never actually showed me the screen. The plan was simple. Hike 12 miles into the wilderness, set up camp near Steer Creek, spend 2 nights under the stars, then hike back out. We'd done dozens of trips like this before. McKelvey was supposed to be easy terrain, mostly grasslands with some scattered patches of pine and hardwood forest near the creek bottoms. What could go wrong? We started hiking at dawn on Friday morning. The October air was crisp and clean, with that sharp bite that promised winter wasn't far behind. The grassland stretched out around us like a brown and gold ocean, rolling hills extending to the horizon in every direction. For the first few hours, everything felt perfect. We fell into our familiar rhythm, Michael setting a steady pace, me following behind, both of us carrying our packs with the easy confidence of experienced hikers. It was around noon when I first noticed the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but something else, something wrong. The wind had died completely, leaving the tall grass motionless as a photograph. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the earth itself was absorbing the sound before it could travel. "You notice how quiet it is?" I asked Michael. He paused and looked around, tilting his head like he was listening for something. "Yeah, actually, weird." But he shrugged and kept walking, seemingly unconcerned. We pressed on, following what the map indicated was an old cattle trail that would lead us toward Steer Creek. But as the afternoon wore on, the landscape began to feel increasingly unfamiliar. The gentle rolling hills gave way to steeper terrain, dotted with dark clusters of pine trees that hadn't appeared on our topographical map. The sky had taken on a strange greenish cast, like the light you get before a severe thunderstorm, though there wasn't a cloud in sight. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" I asked, consulting my compass for the fourth time in an hour. The needle kept spinning lazily, unable to find magnetic north. Michael stopped and pulled out his GPS unit. He stared at the screen for a long moment, his brow furrowed. That's odd. What? According to this, we're about 15 miles southeast of where we started. But that can't be right. We've been walking northwest all day. I looked over his shoulder at the GPS display. The little arrow indicating our position was blinking erratically, jumping around the screen like a trapped insect. Our intended route, clearly marked in red, was nowhere near our apparent location. Must be a satellite issue, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. We'd used GPS dozens of times in remote areas without problems. Yeah, probably. Michael tucked the device away quickly, but not before I caught a glimpse of something else on the screen. For just a moment, the display had shown what looked like a trail or path leading deeper into the wilderness, a path that definitely wasn't on our printed map. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the temperature dropped noticeably. What had been a pleasant autumn day was becoming genuinely cold. We needed to find water and set up camp soon, but every direction looked the same. Endless rolling grassland broken by increasingly frequent stands of dark trees. That's when we saw the smoke. It was just a thin wisp rising from beyond a low hill about a mile to our west. Too much for a campfire, too little for a grass fire. It hung in the still air like a question mark. Could be other campers, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. Or a ranger station, I added hopefully. We changed course toward the smoke, our pace quickening as darkness began to settle over the landscape. The grass beneath our feet had changed too, becoming sparse and brown as if something had drained the life from the soil. The few trees we passed looked wrong somehow. Twisted and gnarled, their bark blackened as if by fire, though I could smell no traces of smoke in the air. As we crested the hill, we could see the source of the smoke below us. It wasn't a campfire or building. It was a perfectly circular patch of burned earth, maybe 20 feet across, with a few charred logs arranged in the center. The smoke was rising from what looked like bones, white and clean, as if they'd been picked bare by scavengers. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Michael didn't answer. He was staring at the burned circle with an expression I'd never seen before. Not fear, exactly, but something like recognition, like he'd seen this place before. "Michael?" He blinked and shook his head. "Sorry, that's really weird. Should we check it out?" Every instinct I had was screaming no, but we needed water, and there was still no sign of Steer Creek. Maybe whoever had made this fire could point us in the right direction. We picked our way down the hill, the burned earth crunching under our boots like crushed charcoal. Up close, the bones were clearly animal, ribs and leg bones from what might have been a deer, but they'd been arranged in a deliberate pattern around the fire pit, forming symbols I didn't recognize. The smell was overwhelming. Not just smoke and ash, but something deeper and more organic. Decay, rot, the sweet, cloying scent of meat left too long in the sun. "We should get out of here," I said, fighting the urge to gag, but Michael was kneeling beside the fire pit, examining the bone arrangements with fascination. "These markings," he said quietly, they're old, really old." "How do you know that?" He looked up at me with an odd smile. "Just a feeling." That was the first time I noticed his eyes had changed. They were still brown, still recognizably Michael's eyes, but there was something different about them. A depth that hadn't been there before, like I was looking into a well with no bottom. "Come on," I said, shouldering my pack. "We need to find water before dark." Michael nodded and stood, but he lingered for a moment beside the fire pit, his fingers trailing across one of the bone symbols. When he finally turned to follow me, I caught a whiff of something on the wind, a musky animal scent that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We walked for another hour as full darkness settled over the grasslands. The moon was new, leaving us with only starlight to navigate by. Finally, we heard the blessed sound of running water ahead. Steer Creek, or at least some creek, gurgling its way through a shallow valley lined with cottonwood trees. "Thank God," I muttered, picking up the pace. The creek was maybe 6 feet wide and knee-deep, with clear, cold water that tasted clean when I cupped some in my hands. We set up camp on a flat spot about 50 yards from the water, between two large cottonwoods that would provide some shelter if the wind picked up. As I was setting up my tent, I realized I hadn't heard Michael speak in over an hour. He was going through the motions of making camp, unpacking his gear, gathering firewood, but with a mechanical efficiency that was nothing like his usual easygoing approach to outdoor tasks. "You okay?" I asked. "Fine," he said without looking up from his sleeping bag. "Just tired." But it wasn't tiredness I heard in his voice. It was something else. Something careful and controlled, like he was concentrating very hard on sounding normal. We got a fire going as the last light faded from the sky. The flames danced cheerfully between us, casting warm light on our small circle of civilization in the vast darkness. For a few minutes, I felt almost normal. We were experienced backpackers. We knew how to handle ourselves in the wilderness. So what if our technology had malfunctioned and we'd gotten a little turned around? We'd figure it out in the morning. That's when I noticed Michael wasn't eating. I'd prepared a simple meal, just dehydrated chili rehydrated with creek water, and we were both hungry after the long day of hiking. But Michael just sat there, staring into the fire, his bowl untouched in his hands. "Not hungry?" I asked. He looked down at the bowl as if he'd forgotten it was there. "Oh, right." He lifted the spoon to his mouth but then hesitated, his nose wrinkling slightly. "Smells different." I sniffed my own bowl. It smelled like chili. Different how? Just not right. He set the bowl aside and grabbed his water bottle instead. I watched him drink, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. In the firelight, I could see that the water in his bottle was dark. Not clear creek water, but something thick and reddish-brown, like muddy water mixed with blood. "Michael, what the hell are you drinking?" He lowered the bottle and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. In the flickering light, I could have sworn I saw dark stains on his lips. "Just water, from the creek." "That's not what creek water looks like." He held up the bottle, and in the firelight, the liquid inside was perfectly clear. Clean creek water, exactly like what was in my own bottle. I blinked hard and looked again. Still clear. "You feeling all right?" Michael asked, and there was genuine concern in his voice. "You look a little pale." Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." But I wasn't fine. Something was wrong. With this place. With the way the night felt too dark and too quiet. With the way Michael kept staring into the fire like he was seeing something I couldn't see. I found myself grateful for the steady crackle of burning wood. The one normal sound in a world that was beginning to feel increasingly alien. We sat in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. The fire burned down to coals, and I was just about to suggest we turn in for the night when Michael spoke. "Do you ever think about what it would be like to just disappear?" The question came out of nowhere, delivered in such a casual tone that it took me a moment to process what he'd said. Disappear? You know, just walk into the wilderness and never come back. Leave everything behind. The job, the apartment, all the expectations. Just become part of the landscape. I studied his face in the dying firelight. "That's pretty dark, man. You having some kind of midlife crisis at 28? He laughed, but it didn't sound like Michael's laugh. It was too low, too rough, like the sound was coming from somewhere deeper in his chest than usual. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just finally seeing things clearly. What's that supposed to mean? But he didn't answer. He just stood up and walked to the edge of our camp, where the firelight faded into darkness. "I'm going to get more firewood," he said. "We'll want to keep the fire going all night. I'll come with you." "No need. I can see fine in the dark." And then he was gone. swallowed by the blackness between the trees so completely that I couldn't even hear his footsteps. I sat alone by the dying fire, feeding it small sticks to keep the flames alive, and tried to ignore the growing sense that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just Michael's strange behavior, though that was part of it. It was the oppressive weight of the darkness around me, the way it seemed to press in from all sides like a living thing. The way the normal night sounds of the wilderness were completely absent. No owls, no coyotes, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just silence. Deep, unnatural silence. 20 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. "Michael," I called out, but my voice seemed to die just beyond the circle of firelight. "Michael, where are you?" No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, playing the beam across the surrounding trees. The weak LED light barely penetrated the darkness, creating more shadows than it illuminated. I took a few steps toward where Michael had disappeared, then stopped. Every instinct I had was telling me not to leave the fire. "Michael!" I called again, louder this time. From somewhere in the darkness, impossibly far away, I heard what might have been a response. A voice calling my name. But it didn't sound like Michael's voice. It was deeper, more guttural, with an odd echoing quality that made it impossible to pinpoint the direction. I stood there for another hour, feeding the fire and calling out periodically, but there was no sign of him. Finally, exhaustion and the hypnotic flicker of the flames began to overcome my anxiety. Michael was an experienced outdoorsman. Maybe he'd just gotten turned around in the dark and decided to wait until dawn to find his way back. It wouldn't be the first time one of us had spent an unexpected night under the stars. I crawled into my tent but left the rain fly partially open so I could keep an eye on the fire. The last thing I remember before sleep took me was the sound of something large moving through the grass somewhere beyond the trees. Not the light, quick steps of a deer, but something heavier, something that moved with deliberate purpose. I woke to the sound of someone unzipping my tent. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting just enough light to see a silhouette crouched at the entrance to my tent. Michael's familiar shape, but somehow wrong. Too tall, maybe, or too thin. The proportions were off in a way that made my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. "Michael?" I whispered. "Hey." His voice was soft, almost gentle. "Sorry I was gone so long. Got a little lost in the dark." "Where were you? I was worried sick." "Just walking, thinking." He crawled into the tent and settled into his sleeping bag. "We should get some sleep. Long day ahead of us tomorrow." In the dim light, I could see his face, and it was definitely Michael. Same features, same beard, same scar on his forehead from a childhood accident. But there was something in his expression that made my skin crawl. A stillness that was too complete, like he wasn't breathing. "Are you okay?" I asked. "You seem different." "Different how?" "I don't know. Just not yourself." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned his head toward me, and in the faint glow from the coals outside, I could see his eyes. They reflected the light like an animal's eyes, glowing with a pale green luminescence that definitely hadn't been there before. "I feel more like myself than I ever have," he said. I lay awake for the rest of the night, listening to the sound of Michael's breathing beside me. Except it wasn't really breathing. It was too regular, too controlled, like someone consciously making the effort to breathe rather than doing it naturally. And every so often, I could swear I heard something else, a low, almost subsonic rumbling that seemed to come from deep in his chest. When dawn finally broke, I was relieved to see Michael looking normal again. He was already up and moving around the camp, rekindling the fire and heating water for coffee. In the morning light, his eyes were their usual brown and his movements had their familiar, easy grace. "Sleep well?" he asked as if nothing had happened. "Not really. You?" "Like a baby." He handed me a cup of coffee and I caught a whiff of that musky animal scent again. Stronger now, like wet fur and something else I couldn't identify. "Michael, I think we should head back today." "Back where?" "Home." Something's wrong with this place. With everything. He looked at me with what appeared to be genuine confusion. Wrong how? We just got here. We haven't even had a chance to explore. Our GPS is malfunctioning. My phone's dead. We got lost yesterday, remember? And last night you disappeared for hours. I went to get firewood. Took longer than I thought. You were gone for over 2 hours. He shrugged. Time moves differently out here. You know that. I studied his face, looking for any sign of the strangeness I'd seen the night before. But he just looked like Michael. Tired, maybe, but otherwise normal. Look, I said carefully, I know this sounds paranoid, but I think we should stick together today. No wandering off alone. Of course, we're partners out here. But even as he said it, I caught him glancing toward the trees with an expression of longing, like he was being pulled by something I couldn't see. We broke camp and started hiking northwest, following the creek valley in what I hoped was the direction of the trailhead. The weather had turned gray and overcast, with a persistent mist that made everything more than 50 feet away fade into indistinct shapes. The silence from the day before had returned, but now it felt actively oppressive, like the landscape itself was holding its breath. We'd been walking for about an hour when Michael suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I listened carefully. "Hear what?" "Singing." I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the soft gurgle of the creek and the whisper of wind through the grass. "I don't hear anything." "It's beautiful," he said, his voice dreamy and distant, like a lullaby my mother used to sing. A chill ran down my spine. Michael's mother had died when he was 3 years old. He had no memories of her singing anything. "Michael, there's no singing." But he was already walking away from me, toward a dense stand of pine trees on the far side of the creek. His movements were fluid and purposeful, like he was being drawn by invisible strings. "Michael, wait!" I splashed across the creek after him, but he was moving surprisingly fast for someone carrying a full pack. By the time I reached the tree line, he had disappeared into the shadows between the pines. I followed his trail for what felt like hours, pushing through thick undergrowth and ducking under low branches. The mist had grown thicker, reducing visibility to just a few yards. I called out repeatedly, but my voice seemed to be absorbed by the damp air. Finally, I emerged into a small clearing where the mist was slightly thinner. Michael was standing in the center, perfectly motionless, his back to me. "There you are," I said, breathing hard. "I've been calling for you." He didn't respond. "Michael?" I walked around to face him, and what I saw made my blood freeze. His eyes were rolled back in his head, showing only white. His mouth hung open, and a low humming sound was coming from his throat. Not a melody, but a single continuous note that seemed to vibrate in my bones. "Michael!" I grabbed his shoulders and shook him. His eyes snapped back to normal, and he blinked at me in confusion. "What? What's wrong?" You were humming, and your eyes—" "I was what?" He looked around the clearing as if seeing it for the first time. "How did we get here?" "You said you heard singing. You walked off and I followed you." "I don't remember that." He sounded genuinely confused. "The last thing I remember is crossing the creek." I studied his face, looking for any sign of deception, but he just looked lost and a little scared, like the Michael I'd known for years, not whatever had been standing in this clearing humming that inhuman note. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Right now." This time, he didn't argue. We retraced our steps to the creek, but something was wrong. The landscape had changed. The creek was flowing in the opposite direction, and the grasslands beyond looked different, more barren, with patches of that same blackened earth we'd seen around the fire pit. "This isn't right," I muttered, consulting my compass. The needle was spinning wildly again. "Maybe we got turned around in the trees," Michael suggested. But I knew we hadn't. I'd been careful to note landmarks to keep track of our direction. We'd walked straight into the pine stand and straight back out. We should have emerged exactly where we'd started. "Look," Michael said, pointing downstream. "There's something in the water." About 50 yards away, something large and dark was floating in the creek. As we got closer, I could see it was a backpack. Not one of ours, but similar in style and color. It was caught on a fallen log, bobbing gently in the current. "Should we check it out?" Michael asked. I didn't want to, but the pack might contain identification, some clue about where we were or what had happened to its owner. We waded into the creek and pulled it to shore. The pack was waterlogged and covered in a thick greenish slime that smelled like rotting vegetation. But it wasn't empty. Inside, we found a sleeping bag, some clothes, and at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag, a journal. The first few entries were normal. A solo hiker documenting a trip through McKelvey Forest. But as I flipped through the pages, the handwriting became increasingly erratic, the entries more disturbing. Day 3. Lost, GPS not working. Think I'm going in circles. Day 4. Found burned area, bones arranged in patterns, heard singing in the night. Day 5. Something is following me. Can't see it, but I know it's there. Day 7. It spoke to me today, sounded like my brother's voice, but my brother is dead. Day 8. I don't think I'm alone in my head anymore. The final entry was barely legible. The letters sprawled across the page like a child's scrawl. It's inside me now. I can feel it moving under my skin. I'm so hungry, but not for food. I looked up at Michael, who was reading over my shoulder. His face was pale, but there was something else in his expression. Something that looked almost like excitement. "Poor bastard," he said softly. "Must have had a breakdown." "Michael, we need to get out of here. Now." "Relax. It's just the ravings of someone who got lost and panicked. Happens all the time in the wilderness." But I was already shouldering my pack. "I'm heading back to the trailhead. You can come with me or not." "Of course I'm coming. We're partners, remember?" We walked in tense silence for the rest of the morning, following the creek through increasingly desolate terrain. The mist never lifted, and the landscape remained stubbornly unfamiliar. Worse, I was beginning to notice changes in Michael again. His gait had become more fluid, almost predatory, and every so often I caught him watching me with an expression I'd never seen before, calculating, hungry. We stopped for lunch beside a small pool where the creek had carved out a deeper channel. I was exhausted and disoriented, my sense of direction completely shot. According to my calculations, we should have reached the trailhead hours ago. "Maybe we should just wait here," Michael suggested as we shared a can of beans. "Someone will come looking for us eventually." "Who?" We didn't tell anyone exactly where we were going. "Your girlfriend knows we're in McKelvey. Sarah knows the general area. This forest is over 100,000 acres." Michael was quiet for a moment, stirring the beans with his spoon. "You know, Dave, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about sticking together." "Yeah? I think you're right. We should stick together. Always." He looked up at me, and in the gray light, his eyes seemed to have taken on that pale green glow again. "I think we're going to be very close friends." The way he said it made my skin crawl. There was an intimacy in his voice that was completely wrong, like he was talking about something other than friendship. "Michael, are you feeling okay? You've been acting strange since yesterday." "Strange how?" "I don't know. Different. Like you're not yourself." He laughed, but it was that wrong laugh again. Too deep, too rough. Maybe I'm finally becoming who I was always meant to be. I was about to respond when I heard something that made my blood run cold. Singing. Faint, but unmistakable. Drifting through the mist from somewhere upstream. A woman's voice, high and sweet, singing what sounded like a lullaby. "There," Michael said, his face lighting up with an expression of pure joy. "Do you hear it now?" I did hear it, and that's what terrified me. Because the voice wasn't human. It was too perfect, too beautiful, with harmonics that seemed to resonate in my bones. and underneath the melody, I could hear something else. A subsonic rumbling that made my teeth ache. "We should go," I said, standing up quickly. But Michael was already walking toward the sound, his movements unnaturally graceful. "She's calling to us, Dave. Can't you feel it?" I could feel it. That was the problem. The singing was pulling at something deep in my brain, awakening a hunger I didn't understand. I wanted to follow that voice, to find its source and surrender myself to whatever was making that beautiful, terrible sound. Instead, I forced myself to turn away and start walking in the opposite direction. "Dave, where are you going?" I didn't answer. I just kept walking, fighting the urge to look back. The singing grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear Michael calling my name, but his voice was changing, becoming deeper and more guttural with each word. I walked for what felt like hours through the endless mist, the landscape growing more and more surreal around me. Trees twisted into impossible shapes. Rocks arranged themselves in patterns that hurt to look at. The very air seemed thick and wrong, like breathing through water. Finally, exhausted and disoriented, I collapsed beside a small stream. It took me several minutes to realize it was the same stream we'd been following all day. Somehow, despite walking in a straight line away from Michael, I'd ended up back where I started. That's when I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the grass behind me. I turned around, and there was Michael. But not Michael. This thing was taller, leaner, with limbs that were too long and joints that bent in the wrong directions. Its face was Michael's face, but stretched and distorted, like a photograph that had been pulled at the corners. "There you are," it said in Michael's voice. "I was worried about you." I scrambled to my feet and backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The thing that looked like Michael smiled, and I could see that its teeth were too sharp, too numerous. "You can't run from yourself, Dave," it said. "And you can't run from me. We're connected now. We always have been." "What are you?" "I'm your friend, your best friend. I know everything about you, your fears, your secrets, your deepest desires. I know about the night you cheated on Sarah. I know about the money you stole from petty cash at work. I know about the dreams you have where you hurt people." Each word hit me like a physical blow. These were things I'd never told anyone, things I barely admitted to myself. "You're not Michael." "I'm more Michael than Michael ever was. I'm what he could have become if he'd embraced his true nature. And I can show you what you could become too." The thing stepped closer, and I could smell that musky animal scent again, stronger now, overwhelming. It smelled like wet fur and rotting meat and something else, something metallic and warm that I realized with horror was blood. "The hunger is growing, isn't it?" it continued. "You felt it since yesterday. The urge to bite, to tear, to consume. That's not madness, Dave. That's awakening." It was right. There was something growing inside me, a gnawing emptiness that food couldn't fill, a craving for something raw and warm and alive. "Fight it," I whispered to myself. "Why fight it? Embrace it. Let me show you what we can become together." The thing that wasn't Michael reached out with one impossibly long arm, its fingers stretched like spider legs. As it touched my forehead, I felt something cold and alien slide into my mind like a parasite burrowing into brain tissue. And suddenly, I could see what it saw. The world was alive with colors that had no names, pulsing with energies that sang in frequencies only predators could hear. I could smell the fear and sweat and adrenaline pouring off my own body, and it smelled delicious. I could feel its hunger, not for food, but for something deeper, for the essence of what made people human, for the warm, bright thing that lived behind their eyes and gave them their sense of self. "Yes," the thing hissed. "You understand now." But understanding was exactly what I needed to fight back. I grabbed the knife from my belt, a simple folding blade I'd carried on dozens of camping trips, and drove it deep into the creature's chest. It screamed, but not with Michael's voice. The sound that came from its throat was something between a wildcat's shriek and the roar of wind through a canyon. Black blood poured from the wound, steaming in the cold air. The thing staggered backward, its face shifting and changing like smoke. For a moment, it looked like Michael again, confused and hurt and very much human. "Dave," he whispered, "what did you do?" But then the illusion shattered and I could see its true form. Something lean and predatory with eyes like holes in the world and teeth that went on forever. I ran. I ran through the endless mist, crashing through undergrowth and splashing across streams, with the sound of pursuit growing closer behind me. The thing was fast, faster than anything that size should be able to move, and it was toying with me, letting me think I might escape before closing the distance again. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I saw something ahead through the mist. A road. A real, honest-to-God, paved road with yellow lines down the middle. I burst out of the grasslands and onto the asphalt, flagging down the first vehicle I saw, a pickup truck driven by an elderly rancher who took one look at my blood-stained clothes and wild eyes and decided to ask questions later. "Hospital," I gasped. "Please." As we drove away, I looked back through the rear window at the tree line where I'd emerged. For just a moment, I thought I saw a familiar figure standing in the shadows between the trees, tall and lean and patient, waiting. The official story was that Michael Williams had suffered some kind of psychological break and wandered off into the wilderness. Search teams combed McKelvey Forest for 3 weeks but found no trace of him. I told them about the strange burned area and the abandoned backpack, but when they investigated, they found nothing. No bones, no journal, no signs that anyone had ever been there. The doctors said I was suffering from exposure and exhaustion, that the stress of losing my friend had caused me to hallucinate. They gave me pills for the nightmares and recommended therapy for the survivor's guilt. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there in the endless grasslands of McKelvey Forest, wearing Michael's face and waiting for the next hiker to wander off the trail. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling outside my apartment, I can still hear it calling my name, promising to show me wonders beyond imagination, promising to feed the hunger that's been growing inside me ever since that day in the wilderness. The hunger I can feel getting stronger every night. I've moved to a studio apartment in downtown Omaha, surrounded by people and light and the constant noise of civilization. I tell myself I'm safe here, but I know it's only a matter of time, because the thing in the forest was right about one thing. You can't run from yourself. And every time I look in the mirror, I can see something moving behind my eyes, something patient and hungry and very much not human. It's inside me now, just like it was inside that hiker whose journal we found, just like it got inside Michael. And I'm so very, very hungry. But not for food. The worst part is that I'm starting to understand what it wants, what I want. The warm, bright thing that lives behind people's eyes. The essence of what makes them human, and I know exactly where to find it. I've been watching the other tenants in my building, learning their routines, noting which ones live alone. Soon, I'll have to feed, and after that, I'll go back to McKelvey Forest. Back to the endless grasslands where something patient and hungry is waiting for me to come home, where Michael is waiting, my friend, my partner, forever.